This is His Inspiration, written by M.S. Parker, narrated by Peter Beck. Copyright Belmonte Publishing, 2019. Chapter 1. Joshua. I'd been hearing music in my head for as long as I could remember. My first memory was auditory rather than visual, and I wasn't sure how old I was at the time. Someone had been singing to me, but there hadn't been any words, just notes. Perfect pitch in a melody that would repeat itself on and off over the years. I would hum it when I was bored or stuck on a problem. Sometimes I'd wake up with it in my head, and it would take days for it to leave. At the moment, those particular notes had been on repeat for 3 days, and every time I tried to write something else, I'd ended up plunking out those same few notes on my keyboard. I let out a frustrated sigh as I pushed back from my desk. Monday mornings were never fun, but today was even more shitty than usual because I was trying to write a jingle for toilet paper. Not just any toilet paper. No, I'd been assigned to write a premier jingle for Fluffy Bottom. The name hadn't gotten any better. I stood up and scratched the back of my head. Who the hell thought it was a good idea to name a toilet paper Fluffy Bottom? Then again, considering the other sorts of slogans and commercials that were out there for things that wipe people's asses, I suppose this wasn't really that strange. Fucking toilet paper, I muttered as I stepped out of my tiny office and made my way down the hall to the break room. A couple of cubicle people glanced up as I walked by, but none of them said a word. I ignored them for the most part, too. Technically, they were part of my team, but I pretty much just let them do their own thing. Since I was number 2 in the department, I could pass the buck to the number 1, Dustin Grellog, and focus on my own work. Like finally cracking the code for a hit jingle for Fluffy Bottom. In the break room, I opened the fridge and reached for my second energy drink of the day. I usually didn't open a second one of these until lunch, but today was already on my last nerve. Do you know who's pitching for the new organic food client? Shit. I'd been trying to get in and out without running into anyone. No. A second voice came from just outside the room. But I hope it's Lexington. The man is sex on a stick. Double shit. I didn't want to have to talk to anyone, and as bad as it would have been to be stuck in a conversation with a coworker about some pitch, it would have been even worse when they came in here and realized that I'd overheard their conversation. Really? You think he's hot? You don't? Strawberry blonde hair, light blue eyes, and damn, the way the man fills out a suit. A low whistle followed the words. I'm pretty sure he's straight. Doesn't mean I can't try to recruit his Fuck. I turned around and took a big gulp from my energy drink. The 2 men standing in the doorway had the same wide-eyed, stricken look on their faces, but I was betting the one whose skin was a sickly shade of gray was the one who'd been checking me out. Fortunately for him, I wasn't homophobic, just heterosexual. Mr. Lexington, the first voice came from the taller of the 2 men. Mr. Grellog is taking point on the organic food account. I stepped past them both without another word. I really needed to look into getting a small fridge in my office so I wouldn't need to leave to get food or drink from the break room. I'd been at Chase Advertising for the past 7 years and had been assigned an office 3 years ago, which meant I'd been having this particular conversation with myself for a while. Every time I thought I needed something as permanent as a refrigerator, I reminded myself that this was just a temporary job, something to pay the bills until I finally managed to do what I really wanted to do. Write music. Real music. I didn't really have much in the way of genre preferences, honestly, though my appreciation for a cappella was a different sort of thing than my usual love of all things musical. Classical, rock, pop, even polka had its place. What I did at Chase wasn't music, not really. Not the way I wanted to do it. Like actors who did commercials to pay the rent when they couldn't get a job on TV or in the movies. Or writers who did greeting cards while waiting for a publisher to finally accept their novel. It might be satisfying for some people, but it wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. All I'd ever wanted was to make music. put together notes and words until they spoke to people. Anything but trying to sell stupid name toilet paper. At least if I was writing music for a TV show or a movie, I'd be bringing joy to people. It wouldn't only be for money. I'd never wanted it to be for money, but I was an adult, and some things had to be for money unless I wanted to live on the streets. That didn't mean I needed to give up my dream. When I sat down at my desk again, I didn't bother pulling up any of my music programs yet. I needed a mental break from all of this, a reminder that my life hadn't completely gone to shit 10 years ago. My left hand absently moved over the keyboard, mentally tapping out that same melody. But my attention wasn't on any of that. No, I was skimming through sites I'd bookmarked, searching for those specific words that always made my heart beat faster. I'd been through each of these sites just a couple days ago, so I didn't expect there to be much difference. But there was always the off chance that, since this was the beginning of the week, there'd be new bands looking for musicians. I could play drums in a pinch, but I was specifically looking for keyboardist, guitarist, or bassist auditions. If I could prove my worth in one of those positions, show the band that I could be useful in a lot of different ways, then I'd be able to quit this soul-sucking job before I had to finish with fucking Fluffy Bottom. Wanted, guitar person. Seriously? If they didn't even know the proper title, this group was probably not the band for me. I'd had enough of the pothead wannabe auditions where guys stoned off their asses sat around discussing band names but rarely played a note. They were more interested in groupies and drugs than they were in the art. Band looking for singer. Nope. I could write and play, but singing wasn't my thing. I could do it, and do it well, but I didn't sing in front of people. It wasn't stage fright exactly, because I never had issues performing in front of crowds. But singing, that was more intimate for me. Guitarist wanted for 3-person cover band. Must know popular wedding songs. I grimaced. A wedding band that played covers or a cover band that played weddings. Either way, it wasn't really what I was looking for, but it had to be better than what I was doing now. So what if I didn't get to write music just yet? I could play what others had written and learn from them. It'd be arrogant of me to think I knew it all. Joshua? A knock accompanied my name, and I quickly hid my browser window even as I spun my chair around. Dustin. A fake smile settled automatically on my face. What brings you to see me? Dustin Grelog was a little over a decade older than me, a fact that she flaunted and denied in equal measure. She wasn't bad-looking, I supposed. Light brown hair, dark blue eyes, pretty features, a decent sense of fashion. If I hadn't known what her personality was like, I might have been attracted to her at one point in time. Once she'd opened her mouth, though, there wasn't anything in the world that could have gotten me to fuck her, and she'd tried. Every few days she'd go from condescending to flirtatious, promising me everything under the sun, including but not limited to promotions that weren't hers to give. In our department, she was the only person above me, which meant my next step up would either be her position or something in another department. When it inevitably got to the point where I had to threaten to tell HR, she'd get pissed at me and go back to acting superior. One of these days, it would go too far, and I really would have to go to HR about her, which would make for some seriously messy shit. Let's face it, she was 5'2" and barely weighed over 100 pounds. I, on the other hand, was 6'5" of mostly muscle. Who would HR believe if Dustin decided to tell them that I'd been the one harassing her? Yet another on a long list of reasons why I needed to leave this place. How are you progressing on the Fluffy Bottom project? She came farther into my office and shut the door behind her. Fortunately for me, the wall leading out to the cubicles was made of glass, so any move she made could be viewed by any number of witnesses. It's progressing, I lied. You know how it is, messing around on a keyboard until something strikes. Her eyes narrowed. Then why do I only see a blank page on your screen? Impulsivity wasn't something I often struggled with, but every once in a while, something would pop into my head and out of my mouth before I could stop it. This was one of those times. Because I'm still trying to figure out what rhymes with scat, other than cat and bat. Dustin's jaw dropped, and I simply raised an eyebrow, daring her to call me on it. She folded her arms and flattened her mouth into a line. That's not funny. You better not try anything like that with the clients. She turned on her heel and walked out, an exit that would have been a lot more impressive if she hadn't wobbled on her 5-inch heels as soon as she stepped outside my office. I turned back to my desk, knowing I'd need to save my search for more auditions until lunch at the earliest. Now that I thought about it, I'd probably need to take a working lunch today, if only to have a defense ready if Dustin decided today was the day she wanted to complain to the big bosses about my attitude. Reluctantly, I returned to the music program and began tapping out different notes, searching for that elusive just right sound that had convinced people to give up on Charmin and AngelSoft and whatever other product they'd been using on their pampered behind. I sat a little straighter. Maybe that was the key. Every toilet paper commercial I could think of talked about the strength and softness of their product. Maybe what Fluffy Bottom needed was to give consumers something other than a song about those two qualities, like something that would stick in their head until they wanted to stick pencils in their ears. A jingle didn't need to be liked to be memorable, just catchy. Like a virus. I closed my eyes and rubbed my forehead. Once upon a time, I hadn't been so cynical when it came to music. Not even the sort of thing I didn't consider serious music. Would there come a day, I wondered, when I'd feel the same way about everything to do with music? Chapter 2. Trissa. I pulled my shoulder-length curls up off my neck, scowling at the sweaty strands that stuck to my skin. It was only March, for crying out loud. I got that this was Los Angeles, but that didn't mean it had to be so crazy hot in this hallway. Or maybe they wanted to make us sweat literally as well as figuratively. See if we could handle the pressure that came with working on a movie set. Granted, the jobs that this group was applying for weren't any of the big names. We were little people looking for little jobs. Errand runners for the big people with big jobs. Some of the people here would take any department, but I was looking for something specific. I was 25, and I'd known what I wanted to do since I was 7, and my mom had taught me how to follow a pattern for a doll dress. I'd started making clothes out of anything I could find, including my dad's favorite t-shirt. I'd felt guilty about it for years, until he walked out on us and never looked back. I shifted my portfolio from one arm to the other and resisted the urge to look at my watch. Yes, I wore a watch even though I had the time on my phone. A lot of people thought it was weird I didn't simply have it as an accessory, but I'd never been late for work or an interview yet. In fact, I was fairly certain I'd gotten more than one job because I'd been on time and someone else hadn't been. This is my 3rd interview this week. The dark-haired young woman next to me leaned closer. 2 movies and 1 indie documentary. What about you? It was Monday. Busy week. Just today. I gave her a polite smile and opened my portfolio, straightening the papers that were already straight. Maybe she'd take the hint. She didn't. What are those? I just brought my resume. Should I have brought something else? Apparently, my neighbor hadn't quite figured out that I wasn't looking for conversation. I could have been rude, but that wasn't really my style. Not unless someone really deserved it. Plus, being overly friendly wasn't that bad. You never knew when or where you'd run into someone again. No need to burn bridges. I'm specifically applying to work in the wardrobe department, I said, closing my folder. I want to get into costuming. Wow, that's great. Her smile looked a bit too wide, a bit too bright. I never would have thought about specializing. I'll bet you have a lot better odds when you do it your way, I said. More jobs to apply for. She nodded, but the expression on her face was uncertain. But if you have more experience in a particular area, wouldn't they be more likely to hire you? That was what I'd been hoping. Well, I've been at this for 2 years, she continued before I could say another word. And I'm still coming to these damn job fairs. I was pretty sure this wasn't what a job fair was, but that didn't really seem like the point of what she was saying. And unless my name was called on time, I was either going to have to help or be a bitch. What do you want to be doing? I asked, settling on option 1 and forcing myself to look interested. I mean, what's your end goal? End goal? Really? I pushed down my impatience. What is it you want to do? She beamed at me. I want to make movies. I waited for her to elaborate, but after 30 seconds, she still hadn't said anything, so I spoke up. You mean you want to be a director? Cinematographer? Producer? She gave me a blank look. I was pretty sure I couldn't word things differently. I understood people who didn't have a particular career path in their lives. Some people wanted a job that they could leave behind them when they left, and then have a life outside. I'd never really thought of anyone having that point of view while working in the movies, maybe in construction crews, that sort of thing. But the type of jobs that came through here were for costuming, makeup, PAs, runners, that sort of thing. Places to either claim as your own or use as a stepping stone. Trissa Harring? The relief I felt when I heard my name brought with it a wave of shame. This woman wasn't doing anything wrong. There wasn't any reason for me to not want to continue talking to her, other than the fact that I wasn't here to make friends. I'd seen many of these same people at numerous interviews I'd waited for, but I didn't acknowledge them beyond simple nods or one-word greetings. That's me, I said, popping straight up from the chair. Best of luck. She wished me the same, and turned to the person on her other side. I sort of wanted to wish him luck too. Instead, I headed for the woman with the clipboard and handed over my ID to show that I was who I claimed to be. You're here for wardrobe? The woman asked in a bored tone. Yes. She practically yawned. This way. I followed her down a short hallway and through the second door on the right. A frazzled-looking woman sat behind a table, and she sighed when the clipboard woman closed the door. Trissa Harring? Yes, ma'am. I sat down in the seat across from her and set my portfolio on the table. I waited while she skimmed the paper in front of her, my fingers twisting together on my lap. The online application had asked mostly the basics, and when I'd been called about the interview, I'd been told to bring a resume. It was the first item in my portfolio. I see you went to the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. She looked up at me. I hope that means you intend to apply for a position in the wardrobe department. It does. I retrieved my resume and handed it over. I also brought my portfolio with me, if you'd like to see some samples of my work. This time, when she looked at me, there was something different in her eyes. She appeared to be impressed. I made a mental note to thank my mom the next time I talked to her. She'd made certain that all of us kids had been prepared when we'd gone out into the job market, and we'd all been raised to be hardworking as well. If it was this hard to get a job with everything I'd prepared, I couldn't even imagine what it would be like to come into this field without that advantage. She took another moment to study me, and then held out her hand. I passed over the portfolio. She opened it, and we sat in silence as she moved through the pages. It took everything I had to keep my face expressionless, as I waited for her to give me some indication that she liked my work. After what felt like hours, she passed the portfolio back to me. You're aware the position you applied for isn't one that involves designing, correct? I nodded, clutching my portfolio like a lifeline. I'm aware of that, ma'am. I know I have to put in my time, prove myself. I'm willing to do the work. There are a lot of people who come to LA with a degree in some sort of design field and think that means they should be a shoo-in. She leaned back in her chair, no longer looking quite as frazzled as she had when I'd first come in. I think my degree gives me a leg up, I said honestly, because that means there are certain things that won't need to be explained to me, but I believe in earning my place. Have you been applying for positions to the studios directly? I'm still trying to get a foot in the door that way, I said. Make connections, networking, that sort of thing. She was silent again, and I tightened my grip on my portfolio until my knuckles turned white. I'd never had anyone talk to me like this during an interview. Usually, I handed over my resume, asked if they wanted to see my portfolio, answered a question or two, and then I was back in the hall. "I'll be making my decisions over the next couple days," she said finally. "Since I can't know what the rest of my interviews will hold, I don't want to get your hopes up. But I do want to give you a piece of advice." She leaned forward. "Don't give up. You have talent. That plus work ethic will get you where you want to be, if you can stomach the politics of getting someone to give you a chance." "Thank you," I stammered, my face hot. I hadn't expected this sort of praise. My mom and siblings had always been encouraging to me, but they were family. It was hard to tell how much was them telling the truth and how much was them supporting me despite a lack of talent. "I hope to be working with you soon, Miss Harring." The smile she gave me was either genuine or this woman was in the wrong profession. "Me too. Thanks." I shook her hand and then left, feeling much better than I had when I went in. Even if I didn't get this job, I'd at least made a positive impression on someone in the field. The trip hadn't been a complete waste of time. I was halfway to the bus stop when the ringtone from my phone's calendar went off. I dug it out of my pocket as I walked, squinting against the sun's glare off my screen to see what the calendar said. Meg's birthday. Shit. I was a horrible sister. I glanced at the time. It was still early enough for me to go get something and take it over to the house. I wasn't on the schedule to work today, and I was sure my roommate would loan me her car. The biggest problem was that I didn't know what to get Meg. She was 8 years old today, but I didn't know her well enough to know what sort of kid she was. She could be a fashion nerd like me, wanting to make clothes for her dolls. Or she could be like our other sister, Lily, and enjoy playing with dolls. As Lily had aged, she changed from playing with dolls to collecting them. She might know more. It'd be better to call her than Brian. I didn't think he'd even sent our sisters cards after he turned 18. Lily and I had cut off contact with our father when each of us had become old enough to choose. But our half-sisters were innocent in all of this. They hadn't caused our dad to leave our mom. Kevin, I thought suddenly. My youngest brother was 15 and still lived at home with our mother. Since he was still required to visit our dad every so often, he'd probably know what Meg was into. He'd still be in school right now, but I could send him a text, and he'd answer me as soon as he got out. Maybe I'd swing by the house and pick him up before I dropped off Meg's gift. I didn't bother lying to myself about my reasoning. I knew that wanting to spend time with my brother was only part of why I wanted him to come with me. He'd always been a good shield when it came to Dad and me. Kevin had been almost 3 when our father left, meaning he didn't have much in the way of memories of us as a complete family. He said it made it easier for him to not hate Dad or Patience. I tried telling him that we didn't hate Patience. It was just weird to have a stepmother who was only 5 years older than me. I found a seat on the bus and tapped out a quick text to Kevin. After that, I sent one to Bevian asking about her car. Friend that she was, she asked if I wanted her to come with me. I declined but let her know I appreciated the offer. The last thing I needed was Bevian getting into it with my dad if he happened to say something asinine, which was always a possibility. The high I'd gotten after my interview was already gone, chased away by the real life I had rather than the one I wanted to be real. Typical. Chapter 3. Joshua. The work I turned in to my boss was decent, and I was sure the client would be pleased. But I wasn't satisfied. It was a half-assed job, and I knew it. I could have done better. I should have done better. My parents had raised my brother and me to work hard and do our best. I'd always thought I'd learned that lesson well. No matter how bored I became with my job, I'd always turned in quality work. Then again, quality was a relative term. If the client was happy, who was I to decide if it wasn't quality? I'd created a bouncy, catchy tune that my boss had loved, playing it over and over until I'd been singing the fucking thing in the elevator. I'd heard other people humming it as I left. By tomorrow, everyone at Chase would know the song, and it'd take weeks for it to finally fade away. I should have been feeling good about that, but it was hard to be proud of my work when the most recent thing I'd written was a bunch of nonsense, literally. The entire thing was a nonsense poem set to music. I remembered reading Jabberwocky in junior high, and how the lines from the poem had stuck with me even though only parts of them were real words. I pushed away my thoughts as I went into my favorite deli. Dinner was all I wanted to focus on right now. I'd eat, work out for a bit, and hopefully get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow, I'd start practicing on each of my instruments to refresh my memory. I didn't want to go into auditions this weekend and be rusty. I was diligent about practicing, but there was no such thing as being too prepared when it came to music. The usual Mr. Lexington? The young man behind the counter was the son of the owners, and a senior in high school. He'd been working here after school for the last couple years, and always seemed happy to see me. "Thank you, Marcus," I said with a smile. He was a good kid. I left a nice-sized tip when I took my food, and hoped that the family still intended for the tips left to the family to go toward Marcus going to college. He wanted to be a physical therapist. There were times I'd wished I'd chosen that type of career to go into. Something mentally and physically challenging, but more traditional, I supposed. Applying for a job might not have been easy exactly, but it wouldn't be like this. One big city would be like another, with plenty of jobs. I just settled in front of the television with a beer and my sandwich when the phone rang. David's ringtone. I sighed. I didn't particularly feel like talking to my oldest brother, but if I ignored him, it'd just make things worse. "Good afternoon, brother." I kept my tone light, hoping this was a social call, and knowing that it wasn't. Still, niceties needed to be observed. "How are you?" "Good, you?" David wasn't the most talkative of the three of us. "It's been sunny, and in the 70s, so good." Silence spread between us for several long seconds, as we waited for the other to either fill it with small talk or get to the point. "Julia is making the final preparations for this weekend. Are you coming?" Right to the point then, except I couldn't remember why David was asking if I was coming home. Why would I fly across the country just to spend a single weekend in New York? I'd gone back for Christmas 2 years ago, Thanksgiving the year before that. Those had been longer trips, for specific reasons. I tried to spend at least one major holiday a year with my family. David sighed, apparently not needing me to tell him that I had no idea what was happening this weekend. "Mom and Dad's anniversary is this weekend." Shit. "You forgot, didn't you?" "Work's been crazy." I hated the excuse even as I said it. Hated myself even for using it. "It's their 39th anniversary, Josh." I scowled. No one here called me Josh. I'd left that name on the East Coast with my family. Still, I didn't need to pick at that just because it annoyed me. "I forgot about the party. I didn't forget about their anniversary. I have it in my phone's calendar." I didn't mention that I probably wouldn't have remembered on my own, and would have ended up scrambling to get them a gift. At least now I'd remember to get something sent out with enough time to get to them. Besides, who threw a party for a 39th anniversary? Next year would be the big one. "I'm not going to bother calling you on any of those lies," David said, frustration clear in his voice. "Just so you know, Julia's been working her ass off to throw Mom and Dad a party. But of course, I'm the only son who's going to be there. As always." I closed my eyes and leaned my head back on the couch. Of course, this was going to turn into a martyr session. It always did when David thought I was shirking my responsibilities as a son. It wouldn't do any good for me to point out that David had chosen to stay in New York and join the family business. I'd never wanted that. My family knew that. I'd always been open about what I wanted for my life. Even though David had never said it, I sometimes wondered if he'd thought about going into business with Dad being like taking over as head of the family. Like he could tell us what we were supposed to do, and we had to listen. It didn't make much sense since our dad wasn't like that, but maybe David thought he was being protective of our parents by taking charge. Either way, it was as annoying as hell. Look, David, I would love to have enough money for me to be able to fly home whenever I wanted. I wasn't going to make this about whether or not I wanted to go home, but about the fact that I didn't have the capability to go at a moment's notice. Only one of my siblings had that sort of money, and we didn't talk. Ever. You know I can't pay for it, he said. You can't ask me to do that. I pinched the bridge of my nose. I'm not asking you for money. I've never asked you for money. I'm just telling you why I can't be there, and hoping you'd understand because you know what it's like to live on a budget. I bit back a curse. I couldn't be having this discussion. It shouldn't even have been an issue. I should have been there all the time. I'd never wanted to leave New York, but after what happened, I couldn't stay. David had never understood. Are you at least going to call them or send something? I'll do both, I promised, hoping it would assuage my own guilt. Should I call during the party or not? Call before, so they don't spend the entire party thinking you forgot them. I heard what he wasn't saying, that he didn't want me to ruin the party he and Julia were planning. It was okay that he wanted that. I didn't begrudge him being the good son. I'll do that. I took a long draught of my beer expecting David to say more, but he didn't. The awkward silence was too much. Is there anything else you needed? No. Another gap of uncomfortable quiet. I'll tell Julia not to count you for the party. The call ended, and I tossed my phone onto the couch. So much for a relaxing evening at home. I picked up my sandwich and ate it, but I didn't enjoy it like I usually did. I didn't enjoy the rest of my beer either. All I could hear in my head was the disappointment in David's voice. All I could picture was what my parents would think when he told them I wouldn't be at their party. And I was sure he'd tell them before I called. He'd want to give them the news so he could promise them that he'd be there the whole time. That he was the one taking care of things. Or maybe I was reading too much into it, and my oldest brother wasn't as much of a manipulative bastard as I thought he was. After all, he wasn't the one who'd betrayed me and completely fucked up my life. I shouldn't be pushing my issues on him. I needed to clear my head, and my original plans weren't going to work. My frustration and tension were building into something restless. I knew from experience that I couldn't just relax this way. I had to burn off the adrenaline and energy. Fortunately for me, this evening in March was a beautiful one. I changed out of my work clothes and into something I could run in, stuffed my phone into my pocket, and then headed down the hall to the stairs. Once I stepped out into the cool, almost spring air, I picked a direction at random and set off, hopeful that when I returned, I'd be able to have a restful night. Chapter 4. Trissa. I don't know why this surprises you. You've known me for, 10 years now? I raised an eyebrow at Bevian Kelly, my roommate and best friend. She had one of those poker faces that made it virtually impossible for me to tell if she was joking or serious. The fact that she was one of the smartest people I knew didn't even factor into the equation, since I'd once watched her search for her phone while holding a conversation on said phone. 5, Vivian, I said finally. 10 years ago, we were both 15 and living on opposite sides of the country. She frowned, a slight crease appearing between her eyebrows. Huh, I guess you're right. I have to ask, were you forgetting how long it had been since we were in college, making us older than we actually are? Or were you forgetting that we'd met in college? I'm not sure. She smiled, her pewter gray eyes lighting up. But at least we're at an age where it's always nice to remember we're not as old as we think we are. One of the things I loved the most about her was her inability to stay down for more than a few minutes before her naturally bubbly personality chased the darkness away. It wasn't that she didn't know how to take things seriously, but rather that she always looked for the silver lining. She was so genuine about it that I never managed to stay annoyed when she did it to me. I always assumed that you didn't know how to drive because a lot of native New Yorkers don't bother learning, since there's so many public transportation options. I stood as the timer on the washer reached 1 minute. It was all too easy to get distracted when talking to Bevian, and I didn't want to spend the entire night at the laundromat. Bevian reached for a strand of hair to twist around her finger, then scowled when she remembered that she'd cut her dark blonde locks short to break this exact habit. I would have thought it was a bit drastic a move simply to prevent playing with hair. But I was the one who'd had to help her 2 weeks ago when she'd cut off circulation in her finger and hadn't been able to free herself. My parents wanted me to learn how to drive, even if I didn't need to. She hopped off the out-of-order dryer and came over to join me. We folded our clothes as she continued her story. I told them I didn't think it was a good idea, but Mom said I needed to know how to drive, in case I was ever kidnapped. I wished I could say that particular bit of information shocked me, but I'd met Bevian's parents. Francie Kelly had come from the sort of old-money, high-society family where kidnapping had been an actual threat. Add in the fact that Bevian's father was one of the top television producers in New York, and neither of the Kellys was overreacting when it came to their daughter's safety. Anyway, she and Dad hired this bodyguard to teach me defensive driving, the kind you'd use when being chased and all that. Bevian's voice, as usual, carried, and I watched the 2 older women at the far end of the washer row turn in our direction. I gave them a sheepish, embarrassed smile, but didn't bother trying to quiet my friend. It wouldn't do any good. At least this way, everyone got to hear what was sure to be an entertaining story. No one bothered to tell Harris that I also needed to know basic driving skills. I'd never been behind the wheel until I went for my first lesson, and I spent almost 2 months with Harris teaching me all these maneuvers and tricks. Bevian held up a black cotton bra, a disapproving expression on her face. This should be hand-washed and hung to dry. It wasn't the first time she told me that. I snatched the bra from her and dropped it in the basket with the other clean clothes. I would do that if there was space anywhere in our apartment that wasn't already being used for your lingerie. She grinned at me and went back to her story. Anyway, my parents sent me out to take the driver's test without bothering to ask if any of the hours I'd put in had been regular driving. So the license person got into the car and told me to pull out of the parking space. She shrugged. Let's just say I'd never heard the phrase, flunked with flying colors before. How have I never heard that story before? I asked. I mean, you'd think it would have come up at some point. And when exactly would it have come up? She countered. When we were being chased by assassins through Beverly Hills? I pointed at her. Your sarcasm, my friend, is much appreciated. You'll appreciate my driving if we're ever caught in a car chase. I'm sure I will. The bell over the door dinged as 2 older women carried their baskets out. For a moment, I wondered if that would be me and Bevian in the future. Then I remembered that she and her boyfriend, CB, had been talking about moving in together, and that wasn't even considering the fact that she might just decide to go back to New York and leave both me and CB behind. I pushed those thoughts aside. Planning for the future was one thing. Worrying about what things may or may not happen due to circumstances I had absolutely no control over was pointless. I'd learned that as a kid. Does this mean you're going to teach me to drive? Bevian picked up one of her shirts and folded it in half before dropping it into our basket. I watched it fall and then looked at her. Will me teaching you to drive have better results than when I tried to teach you how to fold your clothes? I already knew how to fold my clothes, Bevian countered. I've just always sucked at it. Your parents didn't hire someone to teach you how to properly fold garments? I laughed as I said it, but I wasn't entirely joking. She shook her head. We had a housekeeper who did the laundry, but I had to fold and put away my own since I was a kid. That and cleaning my room were always my responsibilities. I had other chores growing up, but those 2 things were always mine. Is that why your room is such a disaster? I asked. You had to spend your childhood cleaning up after yourself, so now you don't want to? Exactly. My phone buzzed with a text alert, and I fished it out of my pocket. Thank you for the model heart. It was exactly what I wanted. Love, Meg. I smiled as I hit reply. I'm glad to hear it, but I can't take all the credit. Kevin told me you'd asked for it. Meg? Bevian asked. I nodded. I have to remember to give Kevin something extra nice for his birthday. He was exactly right. Meg's a little scientist, Bevian said. Not surprising. You said she was smart. She is. I sent off a good night text and put my phone back in my pocket. Is it weird that I hate what my dad did to my mom and our family, but I love Meg and Madison to pieces? That's not weird at all, Bevian said. Meg and Madison are awesome. You've never met either of them, I pointed out. Not true. FaceTime does not count. It does too count. FaceTime introductions are just as valid as face-to-face ones, she informed me. But I still want to meet the Munchkins for real. I've met everyone else in your family. Maybe I'll take them for a weekend in the summer, I said. 3 days and 2 nights with an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old should cure you of ever wanting to spend time with anyone else in my family ever again. If your teenage brother shooting spitballs down my shirt during dinner wasn't enough to chase me away, then I don't think 2 little girls would do it. You never did much babysitting, did you? I asked with a laugh. Only child, remember? She stuck her entire head and shoulders into the dryer and emerged with a single sock. Damn it. Another deposit for the lone sock drawer, I said, plucking it from her hand. Didn't any of your friends growing up have younger brothers or sisters? Yes, but those families had nannies. Ah, yes, of course. Nannies. Why didn't I think of that? Bevian threw a wet sock at me. I caught it and tossed it into the dryer. We'll get pizza and ice cream and watch Disney movies. Meg's a vegetarian, and Madison is lactose intolerant. Not a problem, Bevian said. I know how to make lactose-free vegetarian pizza. Bevy, I love you. I closed the dryer door. But I've seen you try to cook. You lost the security deposit because you blew up the microwave a month after we moved in. In my defense, it was the fork's fault the microwave blew up. Bevian pointed at me. And you've never seen me make pizza. True, but you did leave the fork in the popcorn bowl. She planted her hands on her hips. That's it. We're stopping at Whole Foods, and I'm making pizza for a late-night snack. I was too busy explaining to her the reasons why we couldn't stop for pizza-making supplies that I didn't notice a third person entering the laundromat until he grabbed my purse off the counter and ran. Shit! I nearly twisted my ankle turning so fast. Bevian shouted after me, but I was already heading to the door. She'd call the cops, but by then, the thief would be long gone with my purse. I didn't have much cash, but it was all in there. I'd worked my ass off for every penny of it, and I'd be damned if I was going to let some jerk run off with it. I hit the bar on the door with both palms and it flew open. The sun had already set, but the street lights in this area were surprisingly good. I assumed that because I'd seen him turn right, I'd be able to spot him running away. And that might have been the case if I hadn't run into something large and hard before I'd gone more than a couple steps. I bounced off and landed on my ass, hard enough to jar my spine and clank my teeth together. I'd put my hands out too, and I knew I was going to feel it all in the morning, but I couldn't let myself feel it now. I didn't have the time. I let out a string of curses as I tried to pull my feet underneath me, but as soon as I did, white-hot pain shot through my ankle, and it buckled. Fuck. Let me. I looked up at what I'd hit and found a huge man leaning over me. What the fuck were you thinking? Chapter 5. Joshua. I didn't realize someone had run into me until I'd taken 2 steps back, and she started cursing at me from the sidewalk. I wasn't the most social of people, but I'd always assumed that I had basic conversational skills for situations such as this. Knock someone down, help them up and apologize. I stared at her, completely at a loss for words. I couldn't tell how tall she was, but she looked delicate from where I was standing. Shoulder-length jet black hair and porcelain skin made me think of Snow White, but her mouth was definitely not Disney-rated. To my embarrassment, my mind instantly went to other non-Disney things she could do with her mouth, and blood rushed south. I clamped down on those wayward thoughts and started mentally singing the fluffy bottom jingle. No better way to kill an erection than singing about toilet paper. She tried to stand before I could offer her a hand, but swore again as her leg buckled. A new wave of guilt washed over me as I realized she was hurt. Not just guilt, I realized. An unfamiliar wave of protectiveness hit me too. What the fuck were you thinking? She snapped, her dark eyes angry. My eyebrows shot up. I had no problem taking part of the blame for the collision, but she hadn't been paying attention to where she was going any more than I had been. I didn't see you, I said as I held out my hand. Are you blind as well as rude? She glared at my hand. I was right behind the thief who stole my purse. You managed to not run into him. I remembered seeing a guy running across the street about half a minute before she hit me, and I turned to look, but he was already gone. He could have been anywhere. I knew of at least half a dozen alleyways he could have used to get to the next street over where he had too many escape possibilities to count. I would have caught him if you hadn't gotten in the way. I turned my attention back to the girl who was now gingerly touching her ankle. I'd first put her age around 19 or 20, but now that I studied her a bit more closely, I added a few years to put her closer to 25 than 20. And I noticed something else. She wasn't being bitchy because she was a self-absorbed teenager. She was angry at the situation, including the fact that she was hurt and vulnerable in front of a stranger. He went across the street, I said as I leaned down to put a hand under her elbow. I didn't see where he went from there. It's too easy to disappear in this damn city. She jerked her arm away the moment we made contact, and I mentally smacked myself as I realized that my previous statement wasn't very supportive. I took in a deep breath and tried again. My name's Joshua Lexington. I just want to help you up, I swear. Her eyes narrowed, but she let me set her on her feet, her hand tightening on my arm momentarily as she tested her injured ankle. When she released me, I felt the strangest urge to tell her she could lean on me as long as she wanted. Let's go inside. I'll call the cops while you get off that ankle. The look she sent my way said that my suggestion wasn't a welcome one. I have my phone, she said, her voice softening a little. Besides, my friend should have called them already. I was surprised at how curious I was about this friend of hers. Was she saying that as a protective measure? Something to chase me away if I'd been looking to prey on a lone woman? Or did she have an actual friend waiting for her? A guy who might want something more. A girlfriend, maybe. What the hell was I thinking? I shook my head as she turned back the way she'd come. The laundromat she'd come out of was only a couple yards away. But I'd seen the pain on her face when she tried to put down her full weight. A part of me doubted she'd be able to make it even that far without help, but a larger part thought that she'd do it just to prove she could. Whether she'd be proving it to me or herself, I hadn't yet figured out. I followed a few steps behind her, wondering if at any time she'd turn around and tell me to get lost, or she'd be calling the cops on me too. But she didn't. She stayed focused on her goal, and the reflection in the glass front of the laundromat showed me the determined look on her face. I had to admit, I was impressed. She'd charged after a thief, but even after she knew she wouldn't be able to continue giving chase, she hadn't called for help. She said she had her phone still, so she could have called her friend. No one would have thought any less of her. Trissa! A slender blonde came running the moment the girl, Trissa, stepped inside. What happened? Ask him. Trissa jerked her thumb over her shoulder. Gigantor back there got in my way. Gigantor? Really? I wanted to laugh, but this didn't seem like the best time or place. She turned toward me as she leaned against a washer, and I saw that her eyes weren't brown or black like I'd assumed, but rather a deep purplish blue that I'd never seen before. Not in someone's eyes, anyway. Her fingers snapped in front of my eyes, and I'd realized I'd been staring again. I said you can go. Bevian already called the cops, so we'll wait for them here. What if he comes back? I countered. No decent guy would have let two young women wait alone in a laundromat after they'd been robbed. I could be a jerk sometimes, but I was close enough to my mother to hate thinking about what sort of guy would do that to her. Why would he? Bevian asked. He knows that Trissa was chasing him, and that we'd called the cops. If he got away free and clear with one of our purses, why would he risk getting caught? Logically, that made sense, But I knew criminals didn't always think logically. Maybe he'll think that if he gets to you, he can keep you from pressing charges. Shit. Trissa's eyes went wide. My license and my keys were in there. That settles it, I said. You two can stay at my place tonight. Excuse me? Trissa's expressive face told me exactly what she was about to say. You're just a stranger I literally just ran into. Why are you any safer than the punk who took my purse? I opened my mouth to give her a list of reasons, and then realized that those reasons didn't mean anything if she didn't know that they were true. For all these two knew, I was working with a thief, or I was someone worse than a purse snatcher. You're right, I said. When both girls tensed, I quickly clarified. You don't know me. I know I'm trustworthy, but you don't know that. But you two shouldn't be alone tonight. Why was I pushing this so hard? I didn't know these women. Sure, one of them had run into me, and as a result, had lost the person she was chasing. But I didn't owe her anything for that. I might not have been paying as much attention as I should have been, but neither had she. The only reason she'd been the one of us to get knocked down was the difference in our sizes. We won't be, Bevian said, putting her arm around her friend's shoulders. We'll stay with my boyfriend. If I hadn't been looking at Trissa, I might have missed the annoyance crossing her face. Something told me that Trissa wasn't a fan of Bevian's boyfriend, and Bevian didn't know it. Is he on his way? As soon as I asked it, I wanted to take it back. Everything I said was coming out wrong, making me seem like I was one of those creepy stalkers or serial killers who lurked in the dark, searching for single women to assault or kill. He's working, actually, Bevian said. She yelped as Trissa dug an elbow into her side. What? If this guy was going to turn us into lampshades, he would have done it by now. Fortunately for both Trissa and me, the sound of police sirens filled the laundromat, and we all turned toward the door to watch the blue and red lights flash as a cop car pulled up front. I stepped back, my hands hanging open at my side. I didn't want to get mistaken for a criminal simply because I was a big guy in a room with two women more than a foot shorter than me. The first cop rushed through the door, eyes wide in a way that made me think this was his first crime in progress. The way his hand hovered over his gun worried me as much as the fact that the kid nearly tripped over his own feet as he skidded to a stop. Then his gaze zeroed in on me, and he swallowed hard. What? Who? I mean... The door opened again, and the other police officer came in. I wondered if the exhaustion on his face was from all the nervous energy his partner was putting out or something else. I called, Bevian announced. Some guy stole my friend's purse. Wait, a purse? The younger guy's eyes darted from me to the girls and then back again. I thought this was a robbery in progress. Bevian put her hands on her hips and sighed. It was when I called. This guy came in, grabbed my friend's purse, and ran with it. She chased him but had a little accident. He's not a little accident, Trissa muttered, glaring at me, but I didn't feel the heat of anger in the look this time. When her gaze met mine, pink crept into her cheeks. No, not anger. Maybe interest? Something else? What did you do to her? The younger cop stepped between me and the girls, cutting off my crazy thoughts. The action made me respect him a little more since I was several inches taller and definitely outweighed him. I held up my hands, palms out. I was out running, and when she ran out to follow the thief, we collided. And then you followed her? Now the older cop was giving me funny looks. She hurt her ankle, I explained, trying to keep the exasperation from my voice. And I didn't think it was safe for the two of them to wait here alone, in case the guy came back. If we take you in, are they going to say the same story? How had I ended up as a suspect? I'd just been trying to help. He didn't steal my purse, Trissa cut in. He's annoying, but not a thief. I huffed out a breath. Thank you? I turned my attention from Trissa back to the older cop. Before she and I ran into each other, I saw someone in a hoodie run across the street. I didn't get a good look, but he was probably a little under 6 feet tall and skinny. Fast. Are you sure it was a man? I'm sure, Bevian interjected. I looked over when he first came in. The hoodie was dark gray, and he was wearing blue jeans and sneakers. I saw his hands when he grabbed my purse. He had light brown skin, Trissa said, like a really good summer tan. Anything else? Identifying features? The younger guy jotted down notes as we answered the questions he and his partner asked. Now that I'd given them all that I had to offer, and they knew I wasn't involved in the theft, it'd be easy to leave. The cops wouldn't keep me here, and the women were safe. Once they were done here, they'd go to Bevian's boyfriend's house for the night, and then deal with changing the locks and canceling credit cards. And why was I even going through a mental checklist of the things they'd need to do? I'd already made this too much of a thing. I had my own life and my own problems. I needed to get back to them. "Do you need me for anything else?" I asked during the pause in the interview. I only wanted to make sure that the ladies were safe. "Can you give me a number where we can reach you if we think of any additional questions?" the older cop asked. I rattled off my cell number and then headed for the door. I could feel eyes on me as I left, but I didn't turn around. I just wanted to finish my run and go home. It wasn't late, but I'd had a long day already. I'd cooled down while waiting, so I walked a few feet down the sidewalk and stretched my muscles back out, then bounced on my toes, but didn't take the next step and start jogging. Damn it. I couldn't do it. I couldn't walk away and not know they at least made it safely from here to where they'd go next. The cops probably wouldn't escort the pair home unless they asked, and my gut said that they'd tell the cops they needed to finish their laundry or something like that. Mind made up, I jogged up and down the sidewalk, never going far enough that I couldn't keep my eye on the doors. When I saw the cops drive away after another 5 minutes and no sign of the girls, I knew I'd been right. How had those two survived in LA as naive as they were? Maybe I was misjudging them, and maybe I was being a little chauvinistic, wanting to protect two young women. But I wasn't going to apologize for it. Not when all I wanted to do was keep them safe. I couldn't explain why I felt so strongly that I needed to do it, but I did. Once I knew they were safe in the boyfriend's place, then I'd go home. Chapter 6. Trissa. Bevian and I didn't really say much of anything as we finished packing up our clothes. We'd have to come back a different time to finish our laundry. Neither one of us felt safe enough to do it tonight. We did, however, need to get our things together, so when the cops said that it was the end of their shift and wanted to know if we wanted a ride, we declined. CB didn't live far away from here, and the evening was clear, the way brightly lit. We'd be perfectly safe walking. Especially once I retrieved my emergency can of pepper spray from the side of my laundry bag. Bevian had laughed when I told her that I'd brought 2 cans of pepper spray and a small taser to the City of Angels with me, but I was glad I'd come prepared. I'd need to replace the one that was in my purse, but we'd be properly protected as we headed to CB's apartment. And I had the whole walk to figure out how to get out of staying the night. I could only take my friend's boyfriend in small doses. Even if it was late evening by now, I couldn't handle an entire night and morning with Seabrook CB Hinkle. It had nothing to do with wanting time alone to think about this Joshua Lexington person who'd gotten under my skin. Fortunately for me, my usually observant friend was caught up in the theft and everything surrounding it, and didn't notice that I wasn't joining in her conversation. Not that I was doing much thinking beyond how much my ankle hurt. It felt better than when it had first happened, but before we'd walked a block, I'd started to regret not taking the cops up on their offer to drive us, or the handsome stranger who'd been looking at me so intently. By the time we reached CB's apartment building, my ankle had progressed from throbbing to burning, and when we entered the lobby, I stopped, leaning against the door as I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. I needed to ice my ankle and get it elevated, but I still had to get back to the apartment. As soon as CB heard the full story about what had happened and saw that I was in pain, he launched into one of his snits. I like to call them his great and powerful Oz moments. He was working toward a PhD in forensic chemistry as he worked with LAPD's CSI team, and he thought that made him an expert on everything, including medical and police issues that were far outside the scope of his training. "I'll call CB to come down and help you up the stairs." I opened my eyes to find Bevian giving me a concerned look. I pushed off the door and stood up straight. Most of my weight was on my uninjured foot, but she didn't need to know that. As long as I looked like I could stand and walk, I could convince her that it was safe for me to leave. "That's a good idea," I said. "I think I'll go get something to eat, and if he comes down, he can carry the rest of our clothes up to his place. After what happened tonight, do you really think I'm going to let you leave here alone? With a messed up ankle?" I kept my voice even. "I'll be fine if I don't walk on it too much more. I'll get a lift." She pulled out her phone and sent off a text before taking a step toward me. "I know you, Trissa. You're not going to get food. You're planning to go back to our place and hope the thief shows up there." Damn it. So much for being too distracted to notice what I was doing. At least it was only that reason she'd figured out. I didn't want to have a discussion about why I didn't like her boyfriend while we were in the lobby of his building, and he was probably on his way down to meet us. "I am hungry," I said, placing my hand on my stomach for emphasis. "But I was planning to go back to our place to eat while I waited." "No." She shook her head. "Absolutely not. Tomorrow we'll change the locks. The police will do the investigating. We'll move on with our lives." "We can do all that," I said, making my voice more firm. "Tomorrow. But tonight, I'm going home to wait and see if that thieving bastard shows his face." "And if he does?" "I have my taser." Bevian snorted. More people end up hurting themselves with the weapons they buy than they do any criminal. Movement caught my attention, and I jumped at the distraction. "Hello to you too, CB," I said, looking up at Bevian's boyfriend as he came down the stairs. As always, his sable-colored hair was neatly brushed, his clothes perfectly pressed. He looked like he could have been coming from some sort of fundraiser or dinner party instead of having been home from work for an hour or two. That was how he was all the time, and I wouldn't have minded it if he hadn't been a complete ass about, well, pretty much everything. He acted like the way he dressed made him more important than anyone else around him, including his girlfriend. I didn't really care that much about how he talked to me, but the way he looked down on Bevian annoyed the shit out of me. "I have a chicken in the oven," CB said as he leaned down to kiss Bevian on the cheek. "It's not enough for all three of us, but I have some takeout menus." He wouldn't come out and say that I was the one who would need to be ordering takeout, but I knew what he meant, even if Bevian was still too much in love to see past his bullshit. It was the same dance we always did. He'd bait me, leaving me to choose between looking like the bad guy if I called him on it, or keeping the peace between us. "That's okay," I said, making the same choice I always did. "I'm not staying." "Trissa," Bevian began, "I'll have my phone with me and call the police at the first sign of someone playing with the lock, all right?" CB looked from me to Bevian, annoyance and confusion on his face for a few seconds before everything smoothed over and his polite smile was back in place. "Why would you need to call the police?" "Because someone stole my purse," I said through teeth that wanted to grind together in frustration. "Hence the reason the two of us are in here instead of back at our place." He hated it when I talked like that. He liked to pretend that he was smarter than everyone else because he was working on a doctorate in a scientific field while the rest of us peons only had bachelor's degrees in fashion and design. He didn't believe that anything other than formal education in entirely factual fields like the sciences and mathematics could be considered worthwhile. People who went into those other areas of study only did so because they weren't intelligent enough to do anything else. "Did you file a police report?" "I told you that we were waiting for the police," Bevian said, her smile tightening. "Right." He bent down to pick up one of the laundry baskets. "Let's get this upstairs before the chicken burns." "Take hers," Bevian said. "She doesn't need to be carting this stuff around." "Of course." CB didn't sound pleased, but did as his girlfriend asked. I was willing to bet that it was more because he'd fucked up when he'd asked about the police than it was because he wanted to help. Either way, he was doing what she'd asked, and that was more important than why. Besides, if he took what I was supposed to carry, it would keep me from going up to his place and Bevian talking me into staying. "At least text me when you get back to the apartment, and every hour or so after, just so I know you're safe." She gathered me into a hug. "I don't think that's too much to ask." "I promise," I said, hugging her back. "I won't do anything stupid." The look she gave me said that my definition of stupid and hers might not have been the same thing, but neither of us commented on it. Instead, I pulled up my Lyft app and ordered a car. While I waited for it, I ordered some food to be delivered to my apartment. With any luck, we'd get there about the same time. I really was hungry. Less than half an hour later, I arrived home and got on the elevator at the same time as my delivery guy. Since I didn't have my purse, we had to wait until we got to the apartment for me to get him payment and a tip, which worked out well because I was able to have someone with me when I went inside. The thief hadn't been here, but it was still early, and if he didn't come at all, at least I'd know we were most likely safe. I'd almost convinced myself of it as I sat on the couch, foot propped up under a bag of ice, medicine in my system, and ate my dinner. I considered turning on the TV, but I didn't think I'd be able to hear anyone coming if I had the TV on, so I sat in silence, glancing over at the doorknob every 12 seconds. I'd just finished the last of my meal when someone knocked on my door. My heart leapt into my throat, but I reminded myself that the thief wouldn't knock. He wouldn't need to. He had my house keys. As I stood, a stray thought hit me. What if he was knocking on the door to determine if I was home instead of bursting in and taking the chance we were here? Darting into a laundromat and grabbing a purse was impulsive, but that was no guarantee that every choice this guy made would be the same. I walked as quietly as possible to the door and stood on my toes to use the peephole, my fingers on the security chain, as if that small gesture would keep it firmly in place. I gasped before I could stop myself. Then my heart began hammering at an alarming speed. It wasn't the thief. Unruly strawberry blonde hair, light blue eyes, tall, athletic, gorgeous. Joshua Lexington. "What are you doing here?" I asked through the door. "Better yet, how are you here?" "I followed you." He sounded sheepish, but not apologetic. "I wanted to make sure you and your friend were safe. When I saw you come back out alone, I figured you'd try to go after that thief on your own again." He followed me? The thought was alarming and disarming at the same time. "So, you thought you'd get in my way? Again?" "Seems to me that someone should be keeping an eye on you since you have a habit of running towards trouble rather than away from it." I could hear the amusement in his voice. When a smile tugged at my lips, I forced it away. "And you thought you'd volunteer for that? Why?" He paused so long that I peeked outside again. He was still there, but I could only see his profile. He seemed to be thinking about something, and I wondered if it was my question. I'd meant it more as a rhetorical thing or a joke, but now I was curious to know the answer. "I'm not sure," he said finally, scrubbing a hand over his face before raking all 10 fingers through his hair. The way it stood on end made me smile. "I could ask you why you were doing this instead of letting the cops handle it." I forced the smile away. "I think you just did." "So, what's the answer?" I thought about it for a minute. "I don't really know. It's not only about the purse. It's the idea that someone might have the nerve to use my license and keys to try and take more from me. I refuse to let this guy chase me away from my home." "All right," he said, and I thought I heard admiration in his tone. "But I'm not going to let you do it alone." "I'm not letting you inside," I said immediately, although a big part of me wanted to open the door and let him do just that. "That wouldn't be very smart." He laughed, and the warmth of it rolled over my skin. "That's all right. I can sit out here just as easily. I'm not going anywhere." He was staying here, trying to protect me. As much as I loved my family, they'd never been overprotective of me. I'd always been the one doing the protecting. I wasn't sure how I felt about this change. "We'll see how long that lasts," I muttered as I walked away from the door and tried to forget who was waiting on the other side. Chapter 7. Joshua. I'd hoped Trissa would let me inside the apartment, but I wasn't really surprised that she didn't. What actually surprised me was the fact that I'd followed the girls all the way to an apartment building where I assumed the boyfriend lived. My gut had told me to wait a little longer, just in case the girls weren't going to stay the night. When Trissa had come back out a few minutes later, I was glad I'd waited, as well as frustrated that she'd knowingly put herself into danger again. It had been far too easy to follow her, which meant anyone else could have done it too, including the thief, even if he hadn't had her license. I wasn't going to lurk like some creepy stalker, though. She deserved to know that I was there. If she asked me to go away, I'd do it, but only after she promised to call police into the house, or go somewhere she'd be safe. That hadn't needed to come up, though, because all she'd said was that she wasn't letting me inside. I was okay with that. I could protect her just as well from out here, if it came to that. I took a seat right there in the hallway and leaned back against the wall. This wasn't the most comfortable seat in the world, but that was better than being too comfortable. Me falling asleep out here would completely negate the purpose of what I was doing. I pulled out my phone, thankful to see the battery was nearly at 100%. At least I could check my email, social media, maybe start gathering some ideas for new jingles. Rumors had been flying for the past week and a half that we were getting a huge new account. Something massive like Johnson & Johnson that had thousands of different products that would all need their own specialized PR. An hour passed in relative boredom. I was able to take care of some necessary things like paying bills, ordering a few items that were cheaper to buy online and have delivered. I was in the middle of reading an interesting article on the various uses of bananas when I heard the first noise in the hallway. Well, the first noise that wasn't coming from one of the other apartments on this floor. It was someone on the stairs. I'd used the stairs to avoid running into Trissa, and that might have been the same reason this other person did as well. Not necessarily Trissa, but maybe to avoid someone else. Or maybe they were a health nut trying to count their steps for the day. Either way, whoever was coming was the first person I'd seen on the floor since I'd gotten here. As the footsteps reached the landing, I pushed myself to my feet and stepped across the hall to hide in the shadows as best I could. The first thing I saw was a thin figure in a dark hoodie. I tensed, reminding myself that a lot of people would be wearing hoodies tonight. Then I saw him pull something from beneath the jacket. A purse. Fucking bastard. It wasn't enough he'd snatched a purse from someone who didn't have a lot of money. He had to get greedy and come to their apartment. Plus, he was apparently stupid enough not to even get rid of the evidence. Stupid could equal deadly. Considering he didn't know if they were home or not, his intentions could even have been more sinister than simply theft this time. He was a few steps from the door when he stopped to rummage through the purse. For keys, I assumed. And I used his distraction to my advantage. Growing up as the youngest of 3 boys had taught me the benefit of a surprise attack. I took 2 long strides, arm already up, so the moment he raised his head to see who was coming, my fist collided with his jaw. He dropped like a stone, unconscious before he hit the ground. As I leaned over him to make sure I hadn't done more than knock him out, I was almost disappointed that he was out cold because it meant I couldn't hit him again. Well, shouldn't anyway. I wasn't a naturally violent person, but someone who'd prey on 2 young women just pissed me off. Fortunately for him, he was unconscious. And fortunately for me, I didn't think that his jaw was broken. I'd pushed the hood back to check his pulse, and was able to take a good look at the guy responsible for my increasingly strange evening. Shit, he was just a kid. Well, not a kid, but definitely no older than 20. The ink on his neck and hands was amateur, and most likely the result of prison or juvenile detention, that sort of thing. I doubted this was his first brush with the law. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911. As I explained the situation to the operator, Trissa opened the door a crack. I gestured to the ground, and her eyes widened. She shut the door, and I wondered if she planned on keeping it locked while I waited for the cops. I couldn't blame her. That'd be the smart thing to do. As I was ending my call, however, the door opened again, and Trissa came out. She held out several zip ties. When I didn't take them, she sighed. "What do you plan on doing if he wakes up before the police get here?" she asked. "Knock him out again?" She had a point. I took the zip ties and fastened his hands behind his back. They weren't big enough for his feet, but I doubted he'd come around anytime soon anyway. Your purse is over there. I pointed. I don't know what the police will want from it. Damn it, she muttered. I didn't think about that. What are the chances they'll let me have some things from it? I don't care that much about the actual purse, but I have a few sentimental things in there. I won't tell if you won't, I said. I think they'll be more focused on your wallet, credit cards, keys, that sort of thing. Thank you, she said as she moved over to her purse. I've already canceled my emergency card, and we've got our super coming tomorrow to take care of the lock. That's smart. The sharp look she shot my way made me think I should have reconsidered my word choice. You don't really have the best opinion of women being able to take care of themselves, do you? She asked as she straightened. As beautiful as she was, Trissa was starting to piss me off. I have a very strong and capable mother, but if she knew I'd left you and your friend alone after a theft, or that I didn't make certain you were safe for the night, she'd kick my ass. Trissa's lips twitched like she was suppressing a smile. Well, if I ever see her, I'll be sure to tell her what a gentleman her son was. Thanks. I checked the goon at my feet, making sure he wasn't yet stirring. He wasn't. I'll be sure to seek you out if my parents come out here to visit. You're not a native? She seemed surprised. I shook my head. Bronx born and raised. She gave me a wary stare. You don't have an accent. I answered honestly before I could think about it. One of my teachers at Juilliard was extremely particular about how all of us spoke. By the end of my first year, my accent was gone. You went to Juilliard? She looked impressed, and I felt a long-forgotten flicker of pride. I'd put Juilliard on my resume when I came out here, but it wasn't something I talked about. Too many other memories were associated with it. Bad memories. The sound of sirens kept me from getting to the next inevitable question. Why are you in California? Trissa took her things back into the apartment, and by the time she came back out to the hallway, the cops were questioning me, and paramedics were strapping the thief to a backboard. Explain again how you got involved in this? The female officer glanced at Trissa, then at me. If the two of you aren't involved, then... He's a good Samaritan, Trissa cut in. He was making sure I was safe tonight, and it's a good thing he did. Uh-huh. Not a sound of belief. Wonderful. It'd be just my luck to get arrested for assault because I was trying to help a stranger. When the police left a half hour later, I was, miraculously, not in the back of their cruiser. I was, however, awkwardly standing in Trissa's main room, trying to figure out what to do next. Are you going to call your roommate to come home now that the guy was caught? I finally asked. No, she and CB are probably already in bed. She made a face. I really should have thought before I said that, because now I'm thinking about them having sex. I coughed to cover my laugh, and color flooded her pale cheeks. I looked away, once more taking in the space around me. The room we were in right now served as a living room, with a small kitchenette area off to one side and a small square table bridging the space between. A hallway in the back led, I assumed, to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. It was a fairly standard layout of an LA apartment, at least based on the apartments I'd seen anyway. This is not the sort of conversation I thought I'd be having tonight, she said. You didn't think you'd be discussing your roommate's sex life? I teased as I turned back to her. Damn, it was sexy when she blushed like that. I wondered if she did that all over when she was embarrassed. When she was turned on. My cock twitched in interest, and I reminded it that we weren't here for that. Trust me, she said. I know more about Bevian and CB's sex life than I ever cared to. Is she an oversharer or just loud? My room's across the hall from hers, and I can hear everything. Sometimes I swear she does it just to annoy me, because the next day she'll give me all these details I don't want and thinks it's hysterical. Do you ever return the favor? I meant the question more or less innocently, but as soon as I saw the heat in Trissa's eyes, I knew it hadn't been taken that way. And she hadn't taken it badly either. Trissa took a step toward me, watching me as if waiting for me to backpedal. I didn't. Something in the air between us had shifted, and I didn't know when or how, only that I didn't want it to change again. It had been a long time since I'd let a woman captivate me this way, and I was torn between wanting to play it safe and wanting her. She came closer, her eyes locked with mine, and I wondered when I'd become this person, waiting for someone else to make the first move, except I didn't think it was me. I wasn't the type of guy who needed consistent sex, and I didn't do relationships anymore, but I wasn't exactly celibate. I'd had casual sex with a few different women, always ending things before they could think we were dating. Not that I led them on, I was blunt about what I wanted from the first. I never had an issue initiating things. So why wasn't I doing that now? When Trissa was only a few inches from me, she reached up and curled a hand around the back of my neck. I was more than a foot taller than her, and had to lean down even as she went up on her toes. The spark that went through me the moment her lips touched mine loosened something inside me, and I wrapped my arms around her, picking her up to make things easier. Her arms wrapped more tightly around my neck, her body pressed against mine, and I parted her lips, tracing the curve of her mouth with my tongue. She hooked a leg around my hip, and I dropped one of my hands to her ass, palming the firm muscle. I thought her delicate, but now I knew the truth. She was solid muscle. Not the bulky kind that came from bodybuilding, but the sort that hid under the slightest softness. She pulled her mouth away with a gasp, panting as if she'd run a marathon. I understood the feeling. My own heart was racing, my breathing ragged, and my cock was begging me to take this further. "Do you want to take this to the bedroom?" I asked, my voice rough. When she let go of my neck, I tried to curb my disappointment, but it wasn't easy to ignore the feel of her as she slid down the front of my body, and I had no doubt she knew how much I wanted this. Instead of asking me to leave, however, she took my hand and led me down the hall. The lamp she turned on offered soft illumination in the small room we entered, enough for me to see a weathered dresser to my left, a tiny closet without a door, and a bed that would have been far too short for me to sleep in comfortably, which meant it was probably a good thing we didn't plan to sleep. I almost asked if her bed would hold both of us, but then I realized that meant she'd tell me how many guys she'd had in here, and that wasn't something I wanted to think about. And it wasn't anything that was really my business either. A shirt hit me in the face, and I automatically caught it as it fell, my reflexes working on their own since I was fairly certain most of my higher brain had ceased the moment I saw what she'd revealed. She'd taken her pants off as well, leaving her in plain black cotton undergarments that were clearly more for function than seduction. It didn't matter what they'd been intended for, because they definitely were sexy on her. As I watched, she walked over to her bed and sat on the edge, leaning back on her hands. "Your turn." I pulled my shirt over my head, enjoying the pure lust I saw registering on Trissa's face. I'd had more than one woman tell me I was attractive, but it was always nice to see admiration on the face of the person you were about to sleep with, especially with my history. She wet her bottom lip as her gaze ran down my chest, and I wondered what she'd think when she saw the tattoo down my spine. I'd had a name there once, but a talented tattoo artist here in LA had turned it into a tree, a Joshua tree to be specific. When the tattoo artist had suggested it be based on my name and the fact that I was a musician, I'd been impressed. His finished product had been phenomenal. No one had ever been able to see the name so artfully covered underneath. I pushed thoughts of the past aside and focused on the gorgeous woman sitting on the bed in front of me. I hooked my thumbs into the waistband of my pants and lowered them. When I looked back up, Trissa was already unhooking the front of her bra and slipping it off her shoulders. I let out a low whistle, and she blushed, the color spreading across her chest and down to her breasts. Her nipples were a beautiful pale pink, practically begging me to take them in my mouth. Damn. First, though, there was something I needed to ask. I was done being stupid when it came to women. "Before we get too caught up, do you have protection?" She frowned, and for a moment, I thought things were going to come to an early end. But then her face lit up. "1 second. Bevian always has condoms." I was about to make a smart-ass comment about how condoms weren't one size fits all, but when she returned a minute later, the box she carried was the right size. "Will these work?" "Looks like you and your friend have similar taste in men," I said as I pulled one of the packets free and tossed it onto the bed. Trissa laughed. "Doubtful. I wouldn't be here if you were anything like CB." I gestured to the box of condoms. "What about those?" She laughed again, her face turning red, though I suspected this was embarrassment, not arousal. "Remember how I said Bevian overshares?" I nodded. "I do." "She was usually the one who bought the condoms for her and CB, but one time, he bought them. This box is what he brought over. What he didn't know was that Bevian had been lying a little about what she usually bought." "Lying?" She snickered. "I shouldn't laugh, but you should have seen her face when she told me that she'd been buying a smaller size and swapping out the boxes because CB's ego was fragile." I couldn't help it. I laughed too. And then I was distracted by the way her breasts were moving, and nothing was funny anymore. Chapter 8. Trissa. This wasn't how sex was supposed to go. Not that I really had much to go on, since my one sexual encounter had been with a classmate my first year at FITM. It hadn't been bad exactly, but it hadn't been anything earth-shattering either. The best I could say was that we'd both been sober, and I didn't regret it. I'd already suspected that sex with Joshua would be different, but I hadn't expected to laugh. Then the laughter faded away, and I remembered that I was sitting on my bed in only my underwear, and a half-naked man was standing above me, and the look in his eyes made me want to squirm. He leaned down and cupped my chin, gently tipping my face up to his. His mouth was soft at first, then hardened as he pressed me back. He leisurely explored my mouth as he settled over me, holding his body up so that our skin touched, but his weight wasn't on me. With every breath, the hair on his chest chafed my nipples, sending a shiver down my spine. I ran my hands up his arms, appreciating the way his muscles flexed under my palms, then over his broad shoulders and down his back. I couldn't touch him enough, taste him enough. For years, I'd wondered if I'd simply had a low sex drive, because I'd never really felt the urge to have sex. Not really. I didn't even masturbate much. This, however, I'd be getting off to for a long time. I moaned as Joshua's mouth moved along my jaw, and then I'd tip my head back, letting him kiss his way down my throat. Soft, gentle kisses that intermingled with sharp bites that might leave marks and felt so damn good. "You have amazing skin," he murmured as he kissed my collarbone. "More." I dug my fingers into his hair, wanting his mouth lower, on more sensitive areas. His knees came down on either side of my hips, giving him the balance he needed to be able to get his hands and his mouth on my breasts. Those large hands cupped my breasts, lifted them. His tongue flicked back and forth across one nipple, then the other. Then he sucked one into his mouth, and my eyes rolled back. Fuck. So much of my attention was focused on the pleasure coming from his mouth that I didn't realize his hand was wandering until he slid his fingers over my curls and down between my legs. He shifted his weight to let me spread my thighs and give him more access. I lost track of what and where and how, and every cell tingled and heat coiled, and the pressure built, and I cried out as I came, my toes curling and fingers digging into my blanket. I thought I'd had an orgasm before, but they were mild compared to this. I was still trembling when I opened my eyes to see Joshua smiling down at me. He kissed my forehead and brushed the hair off my cheek. "Wow." He laughed, his eyes lighting up. "I'll take that as a compliment." I put my hand on his chest and scraped my nail over one flat nipple. He sucked in a breath. "I hope we're not done yet." "Only if you're sure it's what you want," he said. I nodded. I am. Less than a minute later, my panties joined his underwear on the floor, and we were both naked. I fully expected this next part to go as quickly as my first experience. After all, Iggy hadn't been a virgin, so I'd assumed he knew what he was doing. Yeah, he hadn't known fuck about, well, fucking. I realized that pretty much as soon as Joshua settled between my legs and didn't immediately start humping me. Instead, he rubbed the tip of his cock over my clit, and I cursed at the overstimulation. Then he rocked against me, and I grabbed his arms. Joshua? He stilled. Yes. I'm not breakable. He gave me a smile that I didn't think many people got to see. I reached up and put my hands on his cheeks. My thumbs brushed the corners of his smile, and the moment threatened to turn tender. I didn't want that right now. The day's experiences had left my body with tension that needed to be released. What do you want to do with me? I asked. To me. He turned his head and slightly bit my thumb. Are you sure you want to know? I do, I said. Because I'm starting to think the other guy I had sex with didn't really know what he was doing. The other guy? Joshua raised an eyebrow. It wasn't bad, I said, but I think you can do better. He took in the challenge with one breath and accepted it with the next. He grasped my thigh and pulled my leg up, opening me wider for him. He didn't say a word as he eased forward, filling me inch by inch until I was gasping, coming apart, flying. His hands and mouth moved over me, spreading their own heat from the outside as his slow, deep stroke spread it from the inside. The feel and taste of him consumed me, and I let myself be lost in him. Let myself forget about the shitty day I had and enjoy the moment. A moment that lasted and lasted and lasted, even as we moved faster, the sound of flesh coming together, mixing with our ever harsher breathing. And he was saying my name over and over like it meant something to him. It was funny in a way that someone who didn't know me could say my name like that. That someone who didn't know me could know me better than I knew myself. How could he know that I didn't want soft and gentle, that I wanted that edge of pain? How could he know that when I said I wanted more, it meant I wanted him to hold me tighter and harder until he'd leave bruises? That I wanted his teeth as much as he wanted my nails? How could he know any of this when I hadn't known it myself? The questions flew through my head, circled, chased all of the other thoughts until it was all I could do to remember to breathe. When I came this time, I screamed, but he caught the sound, his mouth muffling it. This climax was deeper, stronger, all-encompassing, but I still heard him groan as his hips jerked against me. Then he was coming too. He left pretty quickly after we finished. Not that I'd expected him to stick around. We weren't a couple. We didn't owe each other anything. He left, and I took a shower. It was that simple. Life went on the way it always had, and Monday became Tuesday, and Tuesday became Wednesday, and I was back at work just like nothing had changed. Like I hadn't had this amazing, intense experience and no one to talk to about it. I hadn't told Bevian anything. I told myself it was because the last thing I wanted to do was overshare with her. I loved her to death, but I didn't want to be her, and giving her a play-by-play of what I'd done would be the first step. Besides, I didn't exactly know how I felt about it, and that would be something she'd want to talk about. If I couldn't answer the question for myself, how could I answer it for her? One positive thing about being back at work was that it served as a perfect distraction from everything else. I tried not to dwell on the fact that sleeping with Joshua had been a distraction too. If I started self-analyzing everything, I'd be better off heading back to Hudson and admitting that it had been a mistake to leave in the first place. Miss? Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a waving hand go with the call. My fake smile was plastered on before I turned. This wasn't my table, but if I ignored the nice lady with the poorly done hair and nails, Hugh would be pissed. And rightfully so, considering how much slack he gave me when it came to scheduling work around interviews. At least my ankle hadn't been as badly injured as I'd first feared, and a few ibuprofen took care of any lingering pain. "How can I help you?" I asked as I shifted my tray of dirty dishes to my other hip. We were short a busboy since Nathan had gotten a guest role in a superhero movie. I couldn't remember which one. "I'd like another Bronx cocktail." She wasn't slurring her words, but they were definitely getting fuzzy. I'd have to warn Gina. "I'll send your waitress right out with one," I said. "You're not my waitress?" She blearily blinked up at me. "Are you sure? You look like her." Gina was almost 6 feet tall, blonde, and tan. I was not any of those things. This lady was drunker than I'd thought. "We'll get you taken care of." I added her empty glass to my tray and headed to the kitchen, managing to snag Gina before she went back out. "Your Bronx cocktail is well on her way to Hammered." "Damn it," Gina sighed. "I was worried about that." She spent 10 minutes telling me how she'd been passed over for a role for someone younger. And I wasn't sure if she was going to start crying or throwing things. She asked me for another drink. "Thanks, Trissa. I'll take care of it." I glanced at the clock, surprised to find that it was time for my last break. I'd been afraid the day would drag, but it had sped past. I clocked out and headed for the break room. A couple of dishwashers were on break too, but they were involved in what sounded like a heated discussion about the latest Batman casting rumors going around, which meant neither of them even glanced my way as I headed for a seat in the corner. I pulled out my phone, intending to check my email and social media, but found myself staring at the screen where a message said I had a voicemail from an unknown number waiting for me. Hands shaking, I pulled it up and raised the phone to my ear. "This message is for Trissa Harring. My name is Gertie Prouder. We spoke on Monday about a position in the wardrobe department for Never Look Twice. I'm pleased to be able to offer her the position, should she still want it. Please call me back." I barely heard the phone number over the ringing in my ears. I'd gotten the job. It wasn't exactly what I wanted to do, but it was a hell of a lot closer than the other jobs I'd worked. I wouldn't be a general gopher, or even an intern in the wardrobe department. I'd be an assistant to someone who was actually doing the work I wanted to do. This wasn't only a step up. This was a chance for me to watch the practical application of knowledge I'd acquired. I had to listen to the message 2 more times before I felt calm enough to return the call and let Miss Prouder know that I wanted the job. It wasn't until I hung up that I realized I had to talk to Hugh. The wardrobe department would be starting work on Monday, which meant a 2-week notice was going to be difficult. I'd been up front with him from moment one about what I was in LA to do, but I still wasn't looking forward to the talk, especially since I knew the possibility of me going from one production to another without a lag was virtually non-existent. I'd liked working there for the most part, but I wasn't going to even ask if I could come back. I wasn't that arrogant. I needed to do this now, or I'd be jittery for the rest of my shift. I stood up, smoothed down my short apron, and headed for his office. As soon as I knocked, he looked up and swore. "Every time one of you damn kids comes knocking on my door, it's to tell me you're running off to be a damn movie star." I swallowed hard. "Will it be any better if I tell you I'm going to work in the wardrobe department?" He cracked a smile but shook his head. "When do you start?" "Monday." He sighed, but I knew him well enough to know that was his resigned sigh, not an angry one. "I haven't finished the schedule for Friday yet, and you were already off tomorrow. Take tonight as your last night." I blinked, surprised. I hadn't thought that because our schedules ran from Friday morning to the following Thursday night that this might be it. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Why do you think I always ask on applications if you're looking for a career in showbiz? That way I already know. I only get pissed if people lie about it." "Still," I said, wiping my damp palms down my thighs, "I really appreciate how you've handled things with me." "I appreciated you working hard and not acting like this was beneath you." Hugh's voice was even gruffer than usual. "Now get out of here, kid. And if you ever need a job, check back. Turnover here is a bitch." I thanked him again and practically skipped across the hall to the break room. I had one more call to make before I finished out the last 2 hours of my shift. "Bevian, I got the job." I almost shouted the news as soon as she answered the phone. "The wardrobe assistant position for Never Look Twice. I just got the call, and I start on Monday." "That's wonderful. Congratulations." She sounded as thrilled for me as I would be for her when she found her niche. "Hugh hadn't done the schedule for next week, so tonight's my last night. I'll be off in 2 hours, and then we can decide where we want to go celebrate. Or we can stay in, I don't care. We're doing something." A moment of silence told me my plans would have to wait. "I'm sorry, Trissa. My dad came to surprise me, and he's only in town for the day. He wants me to have dinner with him." "Of course," I said immediately. "You haven't seen him in almost a year." "You could come with us," she offered. No, that's okay. "Thanks for asking. But you two need some father-daughter time." I was surprised at how much that hurt to say. Not because I was upset with Bevian or her father in the slightest. I wasn't. I was jealous. Even after all these years, I was jealous that my best friend had a good relationship with her father. I was glad for her, but a small part of me wished I could have that too. My mom and siblings would be happy for me when I told them about the job, but I wouldn't even bother telling Dad. He hadn't shown any interest at all in me since I'd refused to see him after turning 18, and the interest he'd had before that had been sporadic at best. "Are you sure? You know Dad would love to see you." Another twist of the knife. She was right. Her parents really liked me, and I knew her father wouldn't mind a bit that she'd invited me along, especially after he'd heard my news. All the more reason for me to reassure her that I was okay. "It's fine. I'll probably be exhausted after my shift anyway. We'll talk tomorrow and make plans for us to celebrate this weekend. Count on it." "Great. Well, I have to go. I'm on my break, and I don't want to be a bitch and slack off my last 2 hours because I'm not coming back." I ended the call before she could invite me along again. I loved her, and I was happy for her, but I couldn't help feeling a little sorry for myself. Party of one tonight. Chapter 9. Joshua. I'd thought that nothing could be worse than fluffy-bottomed toilet paper. I was wrong. Dustin had walked into my office only minutes after I'd arrived and told me to put what I was doing on hold because we had a VIP client who needed immediate attention. She then handed me the file on Carmine Fisk's company and told me that his famous Fisk's Fish needed a complete rebranding with fresh eyes. This was worse than Fluffy Bottom for 2 huge reasons. One, Dustin had been point on this account since she'd first brought him to Chase Advertising 8 years ago. She mentioned it as often as she could, and I had no doubt she'd do whatever it took to convince Fisk he made a mistake asking for a new person. Reason number 2 wasn't any better. Carmine Fisk was an asshole. Demanding, crass, and many additional negative adjectives. No one wanted to work with him, and she just handed him off to me. The worst part was, I didn't think I could do it. On a normal day, I knew I could outright Dustin no matter the product. Nothing today or yesterday had been even close to normal days. Monday night, I'd been lying there in bed next to Trissa, neither one of us saying anything. And once my brain had started working again, I'd had thoughts going a mile a minute. I'd excused myself with barely a word, grabbed my clothes, and left quickly as possible, but that hadn't helped. What I'd originally thought to be only chaos from having slept with someone completely unlike the women I'd bedded in the past had only been part of what I'd had in my head. The other part was a song. The entire time I'd been pretending to work yesterday, I'd had this blasted song in my head, and it was still there today. All over my desk and filling my trash can were scraps of paper I'd been doodling on, notes and words that I hadn't yet put together. And if I was being honest with myself, I wasn't sure I wanted to put them together. It had been so long since I'd written anything real that I was terrified to do it. What if I only thought this was good? What if I'd actually been mistaken this whole time? And the reason I hadn't been able to find a place in any band was because I'd never been as talented as I'd thought. All of this meant that I not only had this music running around in my head, begging to get out, but I also had all the doubts and fears that I'd shoved into mental boxes years ago. When I'd left New York, I told myself it was to get away from all of the shit that had happened, that I needed a new start away from all the people who'd betrayed me. That was all true, but it wasn't the complete truth. No one knew the complete truth except me, and I never admitted it, even to myself. Oh, what the hell, I muttered as I pulled out a few sheets of paper. I had a great composition program on my computer, but every once in a while, I had the urge to write things out longhand. This was one of those times. I hummed as I wrote, my pencil flying over the paper as I captured the notes that had been driving me crazy since I'd left Trissa. I could tell they weren't quite right, but perfection wasn't important right now. I just needed to get them out of my head. Once I had them all down, I could concentrate on work, and if I ever really wanted to finish it, I'd be able to. After the notes were down, however, the song didn't leave. The lyrics were still there. I didn't always get words with my music, not unless I was trying to write both, and sometimes not even then. But this time, snippets of phrases kept floating in my head. I kept writing, putting the words around the place I heard it in my head. Then I went back, tapping my pencil against my mouth as I waited for the next word or note to make itself known. When nothing came, I started doodling in the margins, a habit I'd started when I was in the 6th grade, and my music teacher had told my class about how art and music were so connected. I wasn't an artist by a long shot. I could barely make recognizable stick figures. But when it came to random patterns and shapes, I could do that. It actually helped quite a bit, letting my mind wander while I drew. Why are you working on paper? Shit. I closed my eyes for a moment before opening them and turning my face to Dustin. Good afternoon. Answer my question. I gritted my teeth and reminded myself that telling Dustin exactly what I thought of her would be a bad idea. I just needed to change some things up, I said. Don't you ever find that you need to go back to the basics? Write something rather than type it? The look Dustin gave me spoke volumes about the way she felt about the work she did. The work we did. How far have you gotten? Fisk's coming in the first thing in the morning, and we need to have something for him, or he'll go somewhere else. I took a minute to look at her, really look at her, and I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. She was twisting her fingers together. She was nervous. What did you do anyway? The question slipped out. Dustin crossed her arms, eyes narrowing into a glare. I don't know what you mean. A moment of awkward silence fell between us, and I decided to let my question go unanswered. I'll have something for you before I leave today. I want you back here first thing in the morning, too, Dustin said. I raised an eyebrow. I'll be on time, same as always. She opened her mouth, and I knew she wanted to tell me to work late tonight or come in early in the morning, but she couldn't. She didn't have that sort of authority. The way our contracts were set up, even the salaried staff's overtime had to come from the top. Technically, she could have gone to them and asked them to authorize the extra time, but she hadn't. That told me she probably didn't want anyone knowing she'd brought me in on this. If I'd been gunning for her job, I might have used this situation to my advantage. But I didn't want her job. Hell, I didn't want any job in this company. I wanted her, the woman who'd brought the music back. I gave myself a mental shake and focused my attention on the woman in front of me. Is there anything else you need before I get back to work? I asked, forcing my mind away from that train of thought. She glared at me for a few more seconds, then turned and walked away. I waited until she was out of sight before putting the papers away. Hopefully, now that I'd written everything down, it'd be easier for me to think about the Fisk account. After a quarter of an hour, I had a few things scribbled down, but it wasn't anything earth-shattering. I could think more clearly, but it didn't make me actually want to write this stuff. Still, I was able to make some headway before a look at my clock said it was almost time to finish for the day. I put together a reasonable promotion and sent it to Dustin, making sure all of my personal copies were on my individual computer and not just the company server. I didn't know for certain that Dustin would do anything like present my work as her own, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I might not enjoy my job, but I wasn't going to let anyone think I was slacking, even if I didn't feel like I'd done my best. When I left work, I was faced with a new problem. I didn't want to go home. The music in my head was back, but now that I'd put things together, it flowed almost into a complete song. It was the first song I'd wanted to write in more than 8 years. It was the first song I thought I could write. And it was all because of Trissa. I just wasn't sure if it was something I wanted to thank her for, or something I wished hadn't happened. I couldn't bring myself to wish that I hadn't met her. That night had been something else, but it had to have been a fluke. If there was one thing I'd learned from what had happened in New York, it was that nothing could be as good as it seemed, not even Trissa. Could it? Damn, I just didn't know. What I did know was that I needed to see her again. I had to see her, talk to her. I needed to reassure myself that I'd made the right decision, leaving the other night. Or maybe I wanted to reassure myself that the spark between us had been real. That my music was really back, and not some fluke that would soon fuck me over by disappearing again. After almost a decade, could I dare to hope that things could change for me? Chapter 10. Trissa. It might have been a little indulgent of me, but I stopped at a store on the way home from work and picked up a small bottle of champagne. If I had to celebrate alone, at least I'd get a little buzz doing it. Since I didn't need to go to work in the morning, I didn't have to worry about a hangover either. I was still trying to come up with all the reasons why it'd be nice to celebrate alone tonight when I saw that there was someone sitting in my hall. I was halfway to my door when he looked up, and I realized it was Joshua. The jolt of surprise I felt was nothing compared to the punch of lust that hit me when our eyes met. "I wasn't expecting to see you here," I said carefully. I hadn't expected to see him ever again, actually. We'd enjoyed our night together, and then he'd left, moving on. "I wanted to talk to you." He stood, and I was reminded just how much bigger he was than me, and what it had felt like to have all that power wrapped around me, knowing that if he lost control, even for a moment, he could hurt me. My stomach clenched. "Did you forget something?" I asked as I unlocked my door. "I didn't find anything, but—" "No, nothing's missing," he said as he followed me inside. I set the bottle down on the counter and turned back toward him. I might not be overly familiar with how a booty call works, but I didn't think sitting in the hallway was the traditional way of signaling that you wanted sex. He laughed, then looked surprised that he'd done it. I actually wasn't here for sex. His eyes slid down my body like he was remembering how I looked naked. "But if you're offering..." It was my turn to laugh, but there was more than levity in the sound. I wanted him to stay, but I wasn't feeling as bold as I had the other night when I'd kissed him. "How about I offer you a glass of champagne? It's not expensive, but it shouldn't be too bad." "Where's Bevian?" He remembered my roommate's name. I wasn't sure if that was because it had only been 2 days, or because we'd met in a memorable way. "She's out with her dad tonight." I went to the closest cabinet and took out 2 wine glasses. Bevian had brought them with her, but neither of us minded when the other used their things. "She'll be home later then?" I poured each of us half a glass. "Maybe, but I'd rather not wait to celebrate." "Celebrate?" He accepted the glass, letting his fingers brush against mine. "What are we celebrating?" "I got a job in the wardrobe department of a new film." I let myself smile. let myself be happy. Congratulations. He sounded genuinely pleased for me as he tapped his glass against mine. We both took a sip. So, that's my reason for having a bottle of champagne when I was coming home to an empty apartment. I leaned against the counter. Now it's your turn to finally tell me why you're here. He flushed, which made me even more curious. I guess you could say I had something to celebrate too, and I didn't want to do it alone. I raised an eyebrow. What are we celebrating for you? He set down the glass and scratched the back of his head. I wrote a song. Well, part of a song anyway. It's more than I've written in years. I honestly never thought I'd write real music again, but I did today. That's great. I hadn't realized he was a musician. I reached out to tap my glass against his. After we'd both taken a drink, I asked one of the many questions in my head. Why did you want to tell me? His eyes met mine. Because Monday night was the first time I've heard new music in my head in almost 10 years. Monday night. Oh. Heat washed over me, leaving behind a restless sort of energy that I'd never experienced before. It wasn't an itch, exactly, but I felt the need to rub my arms or legs. Or maybe I needed to move. I couldn't really tell what it was I needed to do. Do you want some more champagne? I asked suddenly. Neither of us had emptied our glasses, but more alcohol seemed like a good idea. He held out his glass, and I poured it half full, and did the same for myself. So you were a musician? I asked as I put the bottle carefully down. I mean, are. Honestly, I'm not sure if it should be past or present tense, he said, staring at the bubbles fighting their way to the top of his glass. I was one, then I wasn't. Now I don't know. I wasn't sure if that was his way of telling me it was none of my business, or if he was trying to figure himself out, but I didn't feel like I could really ask much. We weren't dating, or friends. I had no idea what we were, and even less of an idea about how to ask that question. Have you always wanted to work on movies? I knew he was purposefully turning the conversation back to me, but I let it go. We were two people sharing good news, and now that the champagne had made the edges a little fuzzy, I was starting to hope that he might initiate another way we might celebrate. I didn't see the point in making things more awkward when they didn't need to be. I've always been interested in designing clothes and costumes, I answered. Until now, I've only been able to get jobs running errands on different sets. This will be the first time I'll be working in an actual wardrobe department. He cocked his head to one side, giving me a searching look that made my stomach do all sorts of flips. Only after he took a long drink did he say anything in response. You don't really look like the sort of person who's into fashion. If I hadn't just consumed alcohol on a more or less empty stomach, I might have been more offended by his comment. Are you saying I'm badly dressed? He laughed. No, just that fashion designer seems to fit your friend more than you. I gave him a mock glare. I'm not sure if you insulted me, Bevian, or all designers. He grinned, the smile slow and lazy, filled with the kind of heat I'd been hoping for. From a logical standpoint, I didn't know why I wanted to have sex with him again. Sure, it had been great, but considering my first experience hadn't been, I was only 50-50 for positive sexual encounters, and sleeping with Joshua again was just asking to break the tie in a bad way, right? Do I need to apologize? His voice sounded deeper as he took a step toward me. I nodded, tipping my head back in order to see his face. How exactly do you plan on doing that? He raised his hand as if he intended to touch my face, but stopped before he made contact. You need to know, this wasn't why I came over tonight. Don't get me wrong, I wanted to do this, but it wasn't the main thought in my head. Then I should probably confess that it was one of the main thoughts in my head when I invited you in for a drink. Was it now? He rested his knuckles on my cheek and brushed his thumb across the corner of my mouth. I suppose that means I have even more to apologize for. I best get to work. Before I could voice my agreement, his mouth was on mine, and every bit of negative tension dropped away, leaving me with the taste of champagne and the feel of him. His hands went to my hips, long fingers curling around the top of my ass, and I leaned into him, longing for the hard press of his body against mine. I had barely known it, but I craved it. His tongue dipped into my mouth, stroking and exploring even as my hands did the same to his body. Under the back of his shirt, I explored the dips and planes of firm muscles, enjoying the sounds he made when I raked my nails lightly over his skin. Feeling bolder than usual, I shoved my hands down the back of his pants, digging into the tight flesh there. Fuck. He picked me up and set me on the counter. His eyes narrowed as he grabbed the waistband of my pants. Up, he growled. I obeyed, and he yanked my pants off. I managed to toe off my shoes, so he was able to free both my legs and toss the pants aside. I'd expected him to straighten, but instead, he went to his knees in front of me, tall enough that he could put my legs over each shoulder and fit himself between my thighs, perfectly positioned for something we hadn't done before. I hadn't done it with Iggy either, which meant this was going to be a brand new experience for me all around. Joshua pressed an open-mouthed kiss to the inside of my thigh, and I let out a fluttery little sigh. He chuckled, and the vibration made me shiver. I'd never thought of laughter as something that could be felt, but damn. I leaned back on my hands to give myself the best view, wanting to take in as much different sensory inputs as possible. He ran the tip of his nose along the thin cotton barrier before pulling it aside. I waited for the embarrassment I'd always expected to feel in this situation, but it didn't come. His face was less than an inch away from my pussy, and all I could really think was how much I wanted him to close that distance and put his mouth on me. I gasped at the first touch of his tongue, the sensation both strange and sensual at the same time. One of his arms stayed at my waist, holding me in place, but the other hand moved under my shirt. My eyelids fluttered as his tongue began drawing designs on my skin, and his fingers worked themselves under my bra. Then he spread my lips, and that wonderful tongue of his started playing with my clit. My eyes closed, and my head fell back, my desire to watch overcome by the need to simply feel. A sharp jolt went through me, and my head snapped up, startled out of the pleasurable haze I'd let myself float on. It took my befuddled brain a moment to realize that the pain was coming from my breast. Joshua had pinched me. What the hell? I looked down at him. Did you pinch my nipple? He winked at me, but his expression was serious. Too far? Now that the shock had worn off, I took a moment to consider the question. I shook my head. No, you just surprised me is all. I smiled at him. Please, continue. He flashed me a smile and scratched a blunt nail over the tip of my hardened nipple. I sucked in a breath, but didn't ask him to stop. That edge of pain twisted something primal I hadn't recognized, and now I wanted more. His eyes stayed locked on mine as he sucked on my clit, each pull of his mouth building the pressure until I buried a hand in his hair, fingers curling into those soft locks. I didn't need to guide him since he knew better than me what he was doing, but I needed something solid to hold on to, and nothing was more solid or real than this man. The sharp pain from another twist of my nipple made me cry out, pushing my body that much closer to release. Then his teeth lightly touched my clit, moving back and forth on the sensitive nub in a whole new form of torture. Friction like that should have killed my arousal, but I only wanted him closer, wanted everything he could give me. Pain, pleasure, the words didn't matter, only the relief that his mouth and hand promised. I practically screamed his name as I came. barely coherent enough to slap a hand over my mouth so my neighbors wouldn't complain. Not that I would have cared. The whole building could have been coming down around us, and I wouldn't have wanted to move. This had to be some sort of weird fluke. No one could be this good at sex, could they? Not in the real world. Then again, I didn't care what reality said should be, only what was, what I could touch. And I could definitely touch him. Chapter 11. Joshua. I carried her into her bedroom where we both made short work of our remaining clothes. When I turned back to the bed, she'd rolled onto her stomach and was watching me over her shoulder. "Is this how you want it?" I asked, putting a knee on the edge of the mattress. I ran my hand down her spine and over the firm muscles of her ass before dipping my hand between her legs. Damn, she was wet, and I didn't think it was all from me. "If that's what you want," she said, licking her lips. "I mean, you did that for me, Trissa." I made her name a warning. "Yes, it's what I want," she said, color flooding her face. "It's one thing to say I want sex, but it's a little different to say, I want you to take me from behind." It was so damn hot hearing her talk like that. I watched the flush move from her face down her back until every inch of her porcelain skin was pink. "The other night, you said something about the other guy you had sex with." I pulled a condom out of my pants pocket. "Am I only the second guy you've slept with?" She looked away, and I leaned over to kiss her shoulder blade. "I'm just curious." "I slept with a friend in college, but that's it. I've never really wanted it before." I wasn't going to make her say it, but my gut said that she hadn't gotten much out of that first encounter, which meant she was telling me what she wanted because she believed I could give it to her. I rolled the condom on, slowly stroking myself as I climbed into bed. I used my knees to spread her legs, then grasped her hips, pulling her up until she moved her arms underneath her, resting on her elbows. I palmed both of her ass cheeks, then slid my thumb down the crease. She took a shaky breath. "Don't be embarrassed of wanting something," I said. "That's how people learn what their lover's like." I was aware that it made it sound like this wouldn't be the last time she and I would be together, but at the moment, I wasn't quite ready to rule it out. Something about her appealed to me on a level I couldn't quite understand, but I was starting to think that I might want to figure it out. My hands moved from her hips up her rib cage, and then under to hold those perfect breasts. A handful each with sensitive nipples just begging to be tortured. She rocked back against me, and I groaned at the friction. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me what you want me to do." She pushed back against me. "Fuck me." I straightened and smacked her ass, earning a yelp. It wasn't hard enough to really hurt, but I was sure it stung. "Do you want it slow and gentle, or hard and fast?" "Hard," she said without hesitation. "Can you make me come like this?" "I'll do my best." She was slick and wet, but still tight as I eased my way inside. Once I'd completely filled her, I didn't stop, pulling back before surging forward so hard that she gasped, arching her back. I held onto her hip with one hand and let the other play along underneath, squeezing her breast and sliding over her clit. Each thrust brought a cry or a whimper, a mixture of sound that threatened to make me come. I moved faster, pounding into her hard enough to bruise my own hips, much less her ass, but she only begged me to take her harder. I might not have been the sort of guy to sleep with a new woman every other night, but I'd had enough partners to know what it usually felt like when I did this. The physical act was the same, but that was where the similarities ended. Half of the women I'd been with had sounded like porn actresses when I had them on their hands and knees. Not Trissa. There was nothing false about how much she was enjoying herself. I reached forward and took a fistful of her hair, using it to pull her head back. Her entire body shuddered, and she cursed. I took a moment to wish that I had a mirror in front of us so I could see what we looked like together, but I didn't dwell on it. I didn't want to miss a moment of this. It was taking all of my self-control not to lose myself and chase only my own pleasure. I let out a sigh of relief when I felt her start to tremble, already recognizing the signs of her approaching climax. I pushed myself harder, letting my own orgasm build even as I increased the friction on her clitoris. When she tightened around me, I coaxed her that last little bit, finally allowing myself to come as she did. White spots danced in front of my eyes, my nerves firing on so many levels that I lost the ability to think beyond my next breath. When I finally came to, I was wrapped around Trissa, our bodies still together. Her eyes were closed, and I could feel her pulse and breathing slowly. If she wasn't asleep yet, she would be soon. Instead of my usual need to get out right away, I had the strangest urge to stay like this as long as possible. Yet another part of this weird connection Trissa and I had. When I woke up, I was alone in bed, but it wasn't my bed. I had a vague memory of getting up at some point, getting rid of the condom, and then coming back to bed. Trissa had snuggled into me the moment I'd settled, pressing her face against my chest. I'd fallen asleep almost immediately and hadn't woken up until just now. I heard the shower going and knew that if I wanted to leave, this would be the best time. I could leave a note and make it back to my place in time to shower before work. Or I could stay here, shower, and eat breakfast before going to work in the same clothes I'd worn yesterday. We wouldn't have time for anything long or leisurely, but I could at least see if she had anything in her kitchen that I could pull together for some semblance of breakfast. My decision made, I rolled out of bed and snagged my underwear from the floor. By the time Trissa came into the kitchen, I had breakfast set out. It wasn't much, but toast, a cheese omelet, and a couple cheese danishes I'd found wasn't too bad. "You're still here." I glanced over at her, and her cheeks were pink. "Is that a problem?" She pushed wet hair back from her face. "No, I just mean that I wasn't expecting it." I smiled and pulled out a chair for her. "I figured the least I could do was make breakfast since I drank so much of your champagne." "You might want to consider bringing some of those pastries next time." She gestured to the plate in the middle of the table. "Those are Bevian's, and she's very possessive of her breakfast food." "I'll make sure I replace them." I sat next to her, trying not to show just how pleased I was with the fact that she'd mentioned a next time. I'd buy a whole box of cheese danishes for Bevian if it meant spending more time with Trissa. "I think she might give you a pass." She smiled at me. It looked a little awkward, but the light in her eyes was real. "She's been nagging me to get a social life." "What did she think when you told her about—" I gestured between us. "I haven't. Not yet, anyway." Trissa took a piece of toast and spread raspberry jam on it, then put a bit of the omelet on her plate as well. "I'm not quite into sharing as much as my roomie." I hoped her "not yet" meant that she wasn't completely opposed to people knowing about us. I took a couple of bites of one of Bevian's danishes, going over the words I'd carefully planned out while I'd been waiting. After a few minutes of silence, I finally spoke. "What do you think about seeing me again? Like a date. Something social you can tell your roommate about, if you want to." "You want to take me on a date?" Trissa's expression was impossible to read. "Just because we slept together twice doesn't mean I'm expecting anything else." "I didn't think that at all," I said. "Honestly, I don't think I would want to take someone out who thought that way." "Then what is it?" she asked, looking so uncertain that I wanted to take her in my arms and remind her just how good we were together. "I'm not saying no. I'm just not sure what prompted it." She had a point. We'd never really done much in the way of talking. Neither of us knew much about the other's dating habits or sexual histories. If I wanted her to take a chance on me like I was taking with her, she deserved to know at least a little of where I was coming from. "I don't do this," I began. "Date, I mean. At least, I haven't in a long time. I had some shit happen back in New York that made me believe that romantic relationships and success in music didn't go together. That was more than I'd ever told a woman, and I didn't plan on telling her details. What I could tell her, however, was why I decided that she was different. I came here to LA and tried to put it all behind me, but my head was fucked up enough that I couldn't write. Nothing worth hearing anyway. Not until this week. I leaned forward. You inspired me in a way I haven't been inspired in a very long time. So you asked me out because after we had sex the first time, you wrote a song? She seemed more amused than insulted, which I supposed was a positive thing considering what she'd asked. I'm asking you out because I've never met anyone who's caused this sort of reaction from me, and I want to get to know you better. She was silent as she finished off her toast, and I followed her example, working through my second Danish. If I was going to replace them anyway, I might as well enjoy them now. We're both working towards some fairly lofty career goals, she said finally. I don't think we should let anything interfere with that. I told myself the rejection was for the best. She was right. But... She licked her lower lip again. If we can date without it getting in the way of work, I'd love to see where things go. I hoped I wasn't wearing one of those goofy-looking smiles that guys did when they were pleased about something, but were trying to keep cool about it. But I was fairly certain that was exactly the sort of smile spreading over my face. I have an audition for a band on Friday evening, but I'm free Saturday. Saturday will be perfect, she said, giving me a smile that lit up her entire face. I don't start work until Monday, and if Bevian wants to go out to celebrate, we can do that on Friday. Great. I glanced at the microwave clock and cursed. I need to get a shower and get to work. Towels are in the bathroom closet, she said. It's too bad we don't have more time, or I'd suggest we share. And now I was hard without the time to deal with it. Damn it. Chapter 12. Trissa. Joshua texted me on and off all day Thursday, and most of the day Friday, mostly just snippets of discussions about what hobbies we had and what we enjoyed. I suspected he was nervous about his audition, but didn't ask, unsure if it would be awkward. It was strange, the things I wasn't sure I could talk to him about. We'd seen each other naked, had talked about sex, but I didn't know much about his family or where he'd grown up. Hell, I didn't even know his favorite color or food. This whole thing between us was just strange. Wonderfully strange. I drove Bevian nuts when we went out Friday evening for our celebration, because I couldn't stop myself from checking my phone every few minutes to see if he'd sent me an update about how his audition had gone. By 9 o'clock, she took my phone and put it in her purse, promising to give it back when we got home. Even though it was nearing 2 in the morning by the time we went back to our place, I demanded my phone, sure that I had missed texts or calls. Nothing. I was disappointed, but wrote it off as him having been tired after the audition, or wanting to wait to give me the good news when he picked me up for our date. I knew that him having not done well was also a possibility, but I didn't want to think much about that. I wasn't a superstitious person, but a part of me felt like I'd been asking for trouble if I thought too pessimistically. I'd planned on telling Bevian that I'd be out Saturday night doing some work stuff, but it turned out that I didn't need to lie, since she announced that she was planning on surprising CB for his birthday Saturday evening and wanted to know if I'd help her bake a cake beforehand. Helping Bevian with a cake was a great way to keep me from giving in to my anxiety about the date and doing something stupid like canceling or nagging him. It even helped a bit with the negative thoughts swirling as minute after minute passed by without hearing from him. I timed things better than I could have hoped, finishing the last bit of fussing over my appearance just before he knocked on the door. I hadn't known where we were going, so I'd gone with simple but nice. My little black dress was a couple years old, but the style was such that it was still in fashion, even if not at the pinnacle. I'd gone with the tallest pair of heels I had, aware that I'd probably be cursing them by the end of the night, but liking the fact that it'd help a lot with the height difference between Joshua and myself. "Ready?" Joshua said as soon as I opened the door. I blinked at the abruptness in his voice, but chalked it up to nerves. My own stomach was in knots after all. "Do you want to come in for a few minutes?" "Better not," he said, rocking back on his heels, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "We have reservations in 20. I grabbed my purse and a light jacket, then turned to find Joshua already halfway down the hall. I frowned. I didn't think I was a particularly high-maintenance person, but I also didn't think it was too much to have expected him to wait for me. Tonight wasn't off to the best start, but I reminded myself that we were both doing things differently than usual, and it made sense for things to be rough at first. Once we were settled at the restaurant, things would be better. Things weren't better. Joshua wasn't flirting with other women or anything like that. He wasn't even messing around on his phone. But he was sullen. And for the lack of a better word, moody. Every conversation I tried to start ground to a halt thanks to his sharp, one-word answers. Even when I asked questions that didn't have yes or no answers, he managed to reduce his response to grunts, shrugs, and monosyllables. I made it halfway through the main course before I'd had enough. "What's wrong?" I held up a hand to stop his "nothing" answer before he could say it. "You asked me out, and now you're acting like you don't want to be here." He pushed at the food on his plate, reminding me of how my youngest brother, Kevin, acted when something hadn't gone his way. Kevin was 15 and wasn't allowed to behave that way. I expected better of an adult and hated how disappointed I was. I told myself to wait until he explained. I'd feel awful if something bad had happened to him and I made things all about me. The band didn't hire me. They said they were going in a different direction, but that I shouldn't give up because there had to be someone out there looking for my sound. Ouch. Not quite as devastating as I'd been imagining, but not pleasant either. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. I reached across the table for his hand, but he didn't look up. After a moment, I pulled my hand back, my face hot with embarrassment. Still, I tried again. "What sort of music do you play? I don't think we talked about that." "I can play pretty much anything," he said, tapping his thumb on the table in clear irritation. "Why do you think their excuse pissed me off so much? I play piano, keyboard, guitar, and bass. I could figure out drums. I have perfect pitch, play by ear, and can read music. I went to fucking Juilliard. What the fuck kind of direction could be outside what I can do?" I glanced around as his voice rose, trying to contain my anger at the scene he was making. "People are looking." "What?" He looked around, glaring at everyone who'd been sneaking peeks in our direction. "Congratulations, you got the show for free." I grabbed his hand. "Joshua, what the hell is the matter with you?" He yanked his hand away. "Embarrassed to be seen with a washout? I don't blame you. I wouldn't want to be seen with me either." "Me being embarrassed has nothing to do with the band rejecting you, and more to do with the fact that you're making an ass of yourself, and you can't even blame it on being drunk." He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Well, I guess I'm not as perfect as you thought I was. Too bad. The sex was good." I stared at him for several seconds, my mind filled with only a single thought. I should have known better. I reached into my purse and pulled out a $20 bill. I had no idea what the total cost of my meal was, but I didn't care. I didn't want to spend 1 minute more here with him. I tossed the money onto the table and stood up. "Let's not waste any more of each other's time, then." I didn't wait to see or hear whatever boorish, moronic response Joshua would conjure up. I was done with him. I walked out and pretended I didn't care that he didn't try to stop me. I'd made a mistake getting involved with him, but at least I was able to correct it before it fucked up my entire life instead of just a week of it. I'd mentally kick myself the whole way home, I decided, but once I got there, I'd forget about Joshua and the past week. I'd get my focus back on work and prepare for Monday. I'd had the right idea before. Focus on my career and ignore romance. Ignore sex. I'd lived without it most of my life. I could do it again. I walked away from the restaurant as I looked for a cab, trying to avoid the humiliation that would come when someone would recognize me as the girl eating with the asshole. Fortunately, I was able to find an on-duty cab after less than a block, and while he drove me home, my phone buzzed with an alert from my voicemail. It must have missed the call I was focusing on Joshua. I didn't recognize the number, but I checked the voicemail anyway. It would take time away from my self-flagellation, but I could handle it. Miss Harring, this is Gertie Prouder. I'm sorry to be calling so late, but I just got the news, and I'm working my way through my list. Unfortunately, production on Never Look Twice has been halted due to issues with casting. They're saying things will be fixed in a few weeks, but to be honest, I've been through this before. My advice is to find a new film or show to work on. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. The voicemail ended, and I played it again, and again. Then I was home. I walked up the stairs instead of taking the elevator, every bit of me feeling wrung out and empty. In 1 week, I'd gone from the happiest I'd ever been to this. I wouldn't call it the worst because I had worse things happen to me than meeting a jackass and losing a job, but it still sucked. My phone buzzed, and I didn't answer it. It could have been Gertie saying it was all a mistake, but I didn't actually believe that. More likely it was Joshua calling to apologize. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want anything from him. Not now, not ever. I needed to get out of this dress, into something comfortable, and have some comfort food. Ice cream, chocolate, maybe chocolate ice cream. What I definitely didn't need was Joshua. Less than 10 minutes after I'd plopped down on the couch with a bowl of double fudge chocolate chunk ice cream covered with chocolate syrup, the door opened, and Bevian walked in. One look at her face, and I knew she'd been the one trying to get a hold of me. Shit, Bevy, what happened? I set my bowl down and immediately went to her, wrapping my arms around her. CB, her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and pulled away, squaring her shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. Can I change into my PJs while you get me some of that? She gestured to my ice cream. Of course. As I did what she'd asked, I mentally prepared a list of all the ways I was going to cause Seabrook Hinkle words of pain for whatever it was he'd done. I'd never trusted him, but I never wanted to be wronged so much. After we'd settled on the couch together, I waited for her to tell her story. Things were going fine, she said. I was in the kitchen, cutting the cake when I heard the doorbell. I didn't think anything of it, not even when I heard a guy's voice. I figured it was just one of CB's friends from work, until I made out what he was saying. By the time I got there, I knew that CB had been cheating on me, lying about who he was and what he wanted. I'd suspected CB wasn't faithful, but I'd never imagined CB with a guy. A year. CB had been with this guy Jared for a year. Jared hadn't known about me either. CB probably lost both the people he was fucking in the span of a couple minutes. I guess that'll suck for him for a while. Oh, Bevy, I'm so sorry. I squeezed her hand. I told him I would have stood by him if he'd just been honest with me. And do you know what that bastard said? Bevian stabbed her ice cream with her spoon. I can't have anyone thinking I'm a fag. Just 'cause I sometimes like to get a little ass doesn't mean I'm gay. Yeah, that sounded like CB. Bastard, I muttered. And then he said maybe the three of us could have some fun for his birthday. She shook her head. You should have seen the look on Jared's face. Poor guy. Guys are assholes. Bevian's eyes narrowed, and she looked from my ice cream to my face and back again. That's speaking from experience. What's going on? You've been weird all week. We don't need to worry about me, I said quickly. It's nothing. Spill. I sighed. You know the gorgeous guy who knocked me down outside the laundromat? Please tell me you got a piece of that. I laughed, but the sound was more bitter than sweet. If she wanted a story, I'd give her one. Mine didn't have an ending any happier than hers. Chapter 13. Joshua. That could have gone better. Then again, hadn't Trissa just proven my point about dating? What was the point of getting to know someone when they were just going to leave when things weren't perfect? I scowled as I finished my beer. I caught the bartender's attention and ordered something stronger this time. Sure, I hadn't been in the best of moods, but in my defense, I hadn't gotten a job that would lead to me getting back into what I'd always wanted to do. Just because she'd gotten her foot in the door didn't mean I had to pretend that my failed audition didn't suck. I downed the drink in one go and ordered another. I was going to have to call a cab as it was. Might as well make it worth the expense. By the time my taxi showed up, I was well past tipsy and into drunk. Not quite blackout drunk, which was unfortunate, since it would have been nice not to remember why I'd wanted to drink in the first place. The cab driver had to ask me to repeat my address, and I did, carefully pronouncing each word. I then slumped back in the seat and thought about how tonight had been a complete waste of my time. By the time I stumbled into my apartment, my drunken indignation had become more like anger. Why had Trissa even bothered going out with me when all she was going to do was nitpick and make me feel bad for feeling down about my audition? Didn't I have a right to be frustrated by the way my life had gone? I hadn't chosen it after all. After New York, I'd thought coming out here would be a fresh start, but the only thing I'd really done was get away from a place that had screwed me over. Here, I'd still failed, but at least they were my own failings. No, that wasn't true. New York had set me on this path. If I hadn't gotten fired, for reasons that had nothing to do with my talent and all to do with fucking politics, I could have started over in LA with an actual resume instead of having to explain over and over again why a Juilliard graduate had spent nearly a decade writing jingles instead of playing real music. Not that I ever gave the real explanation. I couldn't talk about it without name-dropping, and that was the last thing I wanted to do. I'd never give him the opportunity to claim that I'd used his connections to make it. Trissa didn't get it. She was where she wanted to be, working on building a career in the field of her choice. She was in her mid-20s, only out of college for a few years. She had all the time in the world to live her dream. She hadn't been struggling to make it for more than 10 years after being betrayed and shoved back down to the bottom. I pulled a beer from my fridge and dropped onto my couch. I kicked off my shoes, but didn't bother with anything else. Tomorrow morning I'd regret drinking so much, but all I wanted to do now was forget. Halfway through my beer, I got a great idea. Out came the phone. No surprise I was sent straight to voicemail, but I preferred it. She'd have to listen to me now. She couldn't hang up on voicemail. Something about that didn't quite sound right, but I shrugged it off. Trissa, it's Joshua. But you know that because you saw the number and didn't answer. Well, the joke's on you because I'm going to tell you here what I think, and there's nothing you can do about it. I just wanted to tell you that I thought you did a shitty thing, being mad at me because I wasn't all happy and smiley. You wouldn't want to smile if you'd lost another chance at living your dream. But you don't know what that's like because you got your job. You'll be working on a movie with beautiful people and doing what you want to do. I was vaguely aware that I was rambling, but I was saying what needed to be said, and I had more to say. Maybe you should have thought about what it'd be like in my shoes. Not really in my shoes because you have tiny feet. Seriously, do you buy kids' shoes? Maybe you could get the ones with those lights on them to warn people when you're coming. I would have liked a warning. You ran into me and got mad about it. That should have been my first clue. But it doesn't matter because you're gone off to your wardrobe job, and I'm stuck writing about fluffy-bottomed fish. Good riddance, I say. You just get in the way of me reaching my goals. A distraction. You distract me already. God, you're so very distracting. I can't let that keep happening. So bye. Have a good job. Good luck on your life." I hung up and tossed my phone onto the end table. I drained the last of my beer and closed my eyes. I'd just rest a bit, then get a... My phone ringing yanked me out of sleep far too early, splitting my head open with the Rolling Stones blaring from its speakers. I smacked at it until I hit snooze, and then groaned as everything in my body protested the sudden movement. The room spun, and my stomach flipped. A few minutes later, I was still hanging over the toilet, wondering how much more I could vomit before I didn't have anything left to come up, when I remembered that I'd done something even dumber than getting drunk enough to puke my guts out. I'd drunk dialed Trissa, and not a mushy drunk dial or a booty call. No, I'd done something much, much worse. I'd said things that I didn't know if I could ever take back. The thought was enough to make me heave again, and all I had in my head for the next few minutes was a tenuous hope that I wouldn't black out with my head in the toilet. Then again, maybe that'd be punishment enough for the things I'd said to Trissa, both during our date and after. By the time I'd finished in the bathroom, including quite a bit of time cleaning up, my head was pounding and my stomach was still threatening to rebel again. But I knew I couldn't wait any longer to apologize to Trissa, if I wasn't already too late. It figured that when I finally met a woman I actually wanted to pursue something with, I completely fucked it up right from the start. The fact that I'd slept with her twice before asking her out just made things worse, because that meant I knew not only would I miss out on someone I could have had a real connection with, I knew how good we'd been together physically too. I rummaged in my cupboards for something bland and then settled at the table with a massive glass of water. My couch smelled like beer and regret. It'd be a while before I wanted to sit there again. I only vaguely remembered the message I'd left, but I didn't have any calls or texts from Trissa chewing me out, which gave me hope that it hadn't been as bad as I thought. One ring later, I was sent to voicemail, and I knew it had been that bad. If her phone had been off, it wouldn't have rung at all. If it would have gone to voicemail naturally, it would have rung more than it had. Even hungover, I understood what it meant. She declined to take my call. "Trissa, hey, it's me. Joshua. I know you probably don't want to talk to me right now, and I understand why. I was an ass. A self-centered ass who behaved in what I hoped wasn't a totally unforgivable manner. I don't deserve a second chance, but I'd really like one. I meant what I said when I asked you out. Last night wasn't me. I mean, it was because I do sometimes say stupid things, but it's not me all the time. Hell, it's not me most of the time. I'd never claim to be perfect, but let me prove that last night was the exception, not the rule." I sighed and closed my eyes. "Please, Trissa, call me, and let me apologize the right way." I ended the call and sat with my eyes closed, waiting to hear the phone ring, to see Trissa's name on the screen. In the silence, a different sound filled my head, a familiar one, yet different somehow. Complete. I straightened, my eyes popping open. Trissa's song. I could hear the entire thing playing through. All the notes and all the lyrics. I'd never had a song present itself that completely before. Hangover forgotten, I went to the small desk I kept in the corner of the main room. I rarely used it, but this was the entire reason I'd bought it in the first place. I barely heard the squeaking protest of my battered chair. My head was so full. The music poured out of me, taking shape in one of the dozens of half-empty notebooks I kept in random places. Most were filled with doodles and curse words, but something in my gut told me that this song wasn't the only one I had in me. Being with Trissa had unlocked something inside me that I thought I'd lost. I didn't dwell on the irony, instead giving myself over to the music, desperate to record it all before it was too late. Chapter 14. Trissa. I regretted eating all that ice cream last night, but I suppose that extra full feeling I had was better than the hangover I would have had if Bevian and I had gone out to get alcohol. I nibbled on some crackers as I cleaned up the kitchen. Both Bevian and I hadn't felt like doing more than putting the ice cream away to keep it from melting, which meant I had a few things to keep my mind on while I waited for Bevian to wake up. As cruel as it sounded, I was grateful for the other distraction my friend had provided. More accurately, her now ex-boyfriend was responsible for it. I wasn't happy Bevian had gotten hurt, and if CB showed his face around here, I'd break his nose. But I couldn't deny I preferred to be taking care of her rather than thinking about the ways my own life had gone off the rails in the past week. It was a little after noon by the time Bevian made it out of her bedroom. Dark smudges colored the skin under her eyes, and they were somewhat bloodshot, but she wasn't crying. Last night, she'd gone from anger to grief and back again, her changing emotions helping me gain control of my own. I'd wanted to be strong for her, support her, because CB's betrayal was monumentally worse than anything Joshua had said to me. "Feeling up to brunch?" I asked. "Not really." She sat down next to me at the table. "You could have waited for me to help clean up." I shrugged. "There wasn't much here." She gave me a knowing look. "Plus, it meant you didn't have to think about Joshua." I gave her a sad smile that she returned. "It's nothing like what happened to you." She reached out and put her hand over mine. "Pain is pain, Triss. I don't want you minimizing what you're feeling because of me and what I'm going through. You really like Joshua, and he hurt you." I swallowed hard and wished that the tears burning my eyelids would go away. I didn't want to cry about Joshua. I didn't want to talk about him or think about him, but I couldn't keep it all inside. "He called," I admitted. "Twice. I listened to the first voicemail, and he was rambling, drunk, blaming me for everything that happened." The anger I'd felt as I listened to it had driven away the sadness. Talking about it did it again. "What about the second?" she asked. "Another drunk dial?" "I don't know. I erased it." I got up and poured us both a cup of mint tea, something both of us had acquired a taste for in college. I didn't see the point of listening to anything else. Whatever we had is done. I blocked him so I didn't have to worry with it again. "I'm the last person who should be giving relationship advice," she said. "But maybe he apologized on that second call. Maybe you should give him a second chance." I could feel my lips twisting into a parody of a smile. "Or maybe I should just accept that I was right to focus on my career because relationships aren't worth the pain they cause." "Triss, you can't think that." "Why not? Joshua and I were fine the 2 times we had sex because there weren't any strings attached. No expectations. But then he asked me out, and we couldn't get through a single dinner without things falling apart. Why would I want to expend that much energy on something that hadn't even started?" I waited for her to argue with me, tell me that I couldn't give up on love, all the things that she'd told me over and over whenever she brought up the fact that I wasn't dating. But she didn't. She watched me in silence for nearly a full minute, something turning over in her head. I assumed it had something to do with dating, but when she finally spoke, she proved me wrong. "My dad wasn't just visiting the other night." I blinked, scrambling to change direction. "Okay." "He wants me to come back to New York." Her statement took the air out of my lungs even as I denied it. She must have told him no. It was the only possible answer. "One of the late-night shows he's producing needs a wardrobe assistant. I told him I didn't want to be the person who made their career because of who their father is. But he promised me that all he did was give my resume to the head of wardrobe. I spoke with her on the phone Thursday morning, and Friday afternoon, she offered me the job." I felt a brief flare of hurt that she hadn't told me all this before, but pushed it away. I knew Bevian, and she wouldn't have wanted to worry me if it turned out to be nothing. The fact that she was telling me now was all I needed to know how serious she was. It also gave me insight into something she hadn't said at all. You planned on talking to CB about it on his birthday. She nodded, 2 spots of color appearing high on her cheeks. I might not have noticed certain things about CB, but I didn't think things were perfect between us. She glanced up at me, and then looked back down at her hands. I never said anything because I knew you didn't like him. But he and I had been rocky for the last few months. And here I thought I'd been hiding my true feelings. I knew he'd be against me moving because it would mean a disruption in his plans. We couldn't set our plans around him and his life. He never considered my career to be as important as his. That had been one of the things about CB I'd loathed the most. At least I found out before I gave up something important for him, she continued. My heart sank even further. You accepted the job? It's a great opportunity, she said. You understand that, don't you? Of course. I grabbed her hand. I'm just going to miss you. They want me to start in a few days. And the hits kept coming. Oh. Don't worry about the apartment, she said quickly, as if that was the first thing on my mind. I told my dad that I couldn't stick you with the whole rent payment without some time to find another roommate, and he said not to worry. She looked at me intently. If staying here is what you want. I stilled. What was she talking about? She squeezed my hands. I'm not moving into my parents' house, and you know I like having a roommate. I didn't want to look at her in case I was reading too much into what she was saying. I know your family's nearby, and you're close to them, but I can't leave without asking. Is there any way you might want to come with me? To New York? I raised my head and stared at her. You want me to come with you? Bevian smiled. When Dad told me about the job, the first thing I thought was that I didn't want to leave you. I don't want you or your dad to feel like I'm taking advantage of you. I wouldn't want this to ruin our friendship. I would never feel like that. You're the most talented person I know. She smiled at me. I think you would take New York by storm. In that moment, everything shifted, and I knew what I had to do. I've been talking with my mom and siblings for a few months now, talking about my eventual plans to move to New York. They know it's coming. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. And I'm ready. Let's do it. Chapter 15. Joshua. I'd gone through weeks of depression and anger in New York after what had happened, and what I felt now wasn't the same. In fact, I couldn't give a name to it. I only knew that this was worse. I couldn't understand how someone I'd only known for such a short time could leave such a hole inside me. We'd slept together, sure, but we hadn't made it through a single other step that could be considered dating. Hell, we hadn't even made it all the way through our first date. It had been over a week since I'd last seen Trissa, and every day that went by without her making some sort of contact dug a little deeper into my soul. I'd been so certain that she'd at least want to chew me out after the messages I'd left that I'd hardly gotten any work done last week. Besides not being able to concentrate, I'd been checking my phone every few minutes, sure that I'd felt it vibrate. I'd left my phone across my office in my jacket yesterday, and it had kept me from obsessing over it. Well, more or less anyway. Nothing had really helped my focus. Something that Dustin had been all too happy to point out last Wednesday when my Fisk presentation had received a mediocre response at best. Ever since, she'd made a point of checking in on me every hour or so to ask how things were coming along. Friday, I'd almost lost my temper. Dustin had stood in the doorway to my office and publicly berated me for letting down Chase Advertising. She'd thrown in a dig about how she'd expected so much more from someone with my credentials. But it had been her comment about me acting like I was better than this job when I hadn't been able to make it anywhere else in the music industry that had set me off. I'd barely kept it together to ask her to come into my office where, after shutting the door, I'd explained that if she ever did that again, I'd go above her head. The worst part was, she hadn't been off the mark with that last comment. From the moment I'd stepped foot into Chase Advertising, I'd thought of this job as beneath me. I'd always been polite to my colleagues, and I never slacked off, but a part of me had always considered myself apart from them all. They were here because this had been their only goal. They'd gone to college to pursue a career in advertising, or whatever it was someone majored in with this path in mind. In my head, none of them had been good enough to even think about music, if there'd even been that desire there to begin with. It wasn't until this moment, as I sat in front of my computer screen, that I realized I'd never asked anyone why they were here, what had made them want to work in this particular field. Now, I wondered if I'd avoided those sorts of conversations, because it'd make me admit that I wasn't better than any of them. They were better than me. I'd fucked up the one thing that could have made my life better. Being with Trissa would have made me better. She wouldn't have put up with me wallowing or looking down on people. She would have called me on my shit. I knew that because she'd been doing it from the moment we'd first met. The ironic thing was, it had been that quality that had made me lash out at her at dinner. I'd behaved like a spoiled brat, and watching her walk away had been eye-opening. I'd spent so many years blaming everyone else for my life, for the choices I'd made, and then I'd lost Trissa. I couldn't blame anyone else for that. Not even Trissa. One of the interns knocked on my door. "Mr. Lexington?" Shit. I couldn't even remember the kid's name. When had I gotten so self-involved? "Yes." "Miss Grelog wants to know if you have a new tagline for the Fisk account." I scowled, reminding myself not to shoot the messenger. "Not yet. I'll have it to her by the end of the day." The intern nodded before scurrying away. I'd been trying to come up with something new since yesterday. I had a wastebasket filled with crumpled papers and discarded ideas. Some of them were even about the Fisk account. Most of them, however, were notes and lyrics of new songs. When I'd finished the first one, I'd imagined that I was done. I'd hoped that being with Trissa might prompt more, but when she'd left, I'd assumed that had been it. By midweek last week, my mind had been filled again. More lyrics, more notes, not just piano, but other instruments too. I'd always enjoyed the composition aspect of things as much as performing, but I hadn't realized how much losing that part of me had hurt until I'd started doing it again. I had a different kind of pain as I worked, but it was cathartic nonetheless. But I needed to work, actual work that paid the bills. I sighed and pushed aside my latest composition. It had been going through my head all morning, and getting the music onto paper had muted it, but I knew it wouldn't go silent until it was all out. Still, it wasn't as loud as it had been. "Fisk's fish," I said as I pulled up the account. "Fucking Fisk's fish. Fisk's fucking fish." That was a winner right there. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. It was going to be a long day. By the time I left Chase, I delivered a decent tagline for Fisk, and I had a folder full of original songs, almost enough for a full album, if that was something I thought I could do, something I still wanted to do. I didn't know what I wanted anymore, except one thing: Trissa. I wanted her. It was the only clear, pure thought in my mind. And I was through waiting. I needed to see her. She could tell me to go away, but at least she'd be talking to me. I'd known for certain how she felt. It wouldn't be silence, where I was guessing and second-guessing. Any answer had to be better than not knowing. I took the stairs up to Trissa's floor, dragging out the ascent even though I wanted to see her. I was still nervous about how she'd take me being there, and the combination of anxiety and eagerness was enough to make my stomach hurt. When I reached her floor, however, I was ready. After 5 minutes of knocking, waiting, and then knocking again, it appeared that Trissa wasn't ready to talk to me. Maybe I should have taken the hint when she didn't return my calls or send me a text. "No one's coming to that door, my friend." I turned to see a short, muscular man with skin the color of polished teak coming toward me. "What do you mean?" "Pretty sure I didn't stutter," he said. He jerked his chin toward the door. "Which one were you banging?" I held up my hands. "Wait a minute, I'm lost. Who are you and what are you talking about?" "C.B. Hinkle." He held out a hand. "Bevian's boyfriend," I said, extending my hand as well for a quick shake. "Not anymore." He pulled a key out of his pocket, which leads me to being here to get my shit. Bitch better have left it. I barely knew Bevian and Trissa probably hated my guts. But if that bastard insulted either of the girls again, I was going to knock out a couple teeth. Then the rest of what he said clicked. Left it? I feel like I missed something. CB sighed and half turned toward me, key in the lock, hand on the doorknob. Seriously? Who are you? How was I supposed to answer this question? I dated Trissa a couple of times. He laughed, and my hand curled into a fist. She obviously didn't think much of you if she didn't tell you. Bevian dumped me, and I still got the news. I now understood why Trissa didn't like this guy. How about you share this news with me? CB shrugged. Not much to share. I got a text from Bevian that said she and Trissa were moving to New York, and I could get my stuff at any point after they were gone. She promised me she wouldn't break anything or throw anything away if I did that. I felt like I'd been sucker punched. Trissa had moved to the other side of the country, and I couldn't help but feel like she'd done it to get away from me. Arrogant of me, I knew, but there it was. Bevian didn't say it, but I'm pretty sure her dad finally convinced her to move back. Bevian's from New York, I said, scrubbing a hand down my whiskered jaw. I didn't know that. Yeah, her dad's some big shot. He opened the door and walked inside as if he owned the place. I followed. Sure, he must be wrong. But with the exception of a few things, the place was empty. While CB walked around gathering things, I stared at the place where I'd spent 2 nights. 2 nights that had changed everything for me. But if Trissa had been able to leave without even telling me, what did that say about how she viewed that time? And what was I willing to do about it? Chapter 16. Trissa. New York City was nothing like Los Angeles. They were the 2 biggest cities in the U.S. when it came to movies, television, and the stage, but the 2 places couldn't be more different. It was quite an adjustment, and I wasn't sure how long it would take before the East Coast became home. I'd referred to L.A. as home not long after I moved there, but I'd grown up around San Bernardino, so it hadn't felt too weird. Here, nothing felt familiar. Not the way the buildings crowded together, stretched so high. The traffic was bad, but even that was different. The weather had been a shock from moment one. Gray and rainy had been the majority of my days so far, and I'd been told that would be the case for March, and probably all of April too. At least one of the differences was all good rather than bad. I'd already gotten a job, and it wasn't waiting tables. Trissa, Othello needs another collar. One of the interns came rushing into the wardrobe department, more flustered than I'd seen her. I sighed. I'll take care of it. You can go ahead home for the day. My direct boss, the head of the wardrobe department, had left half an hour ago to look for a specific kind of kilt for the main character, and she'd left me in charge until the day was done. Considering the rest of the department was made up of 2 seamstresses and 3 unpaid interns, most people wouldn't think this was a big deal. But most people wouldn't have just come from having a job canceled and then land a position as a personal assistant to the head of wardrobe on a small, off-Broadway play. It didn't pay much, but it was a job in the career I'd always wanted. How could I not be thrilled? I'd met Bevian's father the day she and I landed at the airport. He'd come to pick us up himself, making me even more jealous of his relationship with my friend. Then he told me about some jobs he knew about and gave me the names of who I should send my resume to. And he hadn't once behaved as if I needed his help to actually get one of the jobs. It was all exactly how I wanted it. I should have been thrilled with my new life. A little bit of homesickness came with knowing that I was no longer a fairly short drive from the neighborhood where I'd grown up, from my mom and siblings, but it hadn't been like I visited them every weekend. I had my own life in L.A., and they understood that. It was just strange, being so far away. That was normal, expected. But it wasn't only that minute strangeness that dampened my excitement about this new life I was living. It was Joshua. Not because I missed him. No, that wasn't it at all. I didn't regret walking out of our date. He'd been rude and spiteful, showing his true colors. I'd made a wise decision, leaving him in that restaurant. What I did regret, however, was that I hadn't gotten closure. I'd listened to the first drunken message and decided that I hadn't wanted to deal with anything else. So I'd left it alone, pushed it aside, and refused to think about it. Or rather, I tried not to think about it. Most of the time I was successful, thanks to how busy I'd been getting settled into a new place in a new city, working a new job. But in those rare, quiet moments where I wasn't doing anything, not even sleeping, I found myself wishing that I'd called him back, if only just to tell him never to call me again. Trissa? I turned at the sound of my name and smiled at the man standing in the doorway. Othello Dern liked to say that he'd been born to be an actor because he hadn't changed his name to Othello. He'd actually been given that name at birth. Othello Hamlet Dern. He was proud of that moniker, but I often wondered if being named after two of the bard's most famous tragic figures was a good thing. You need a new collar, right? I stood and crossed to where the priest costumes hung. Yeah, when I was pulling it off during rehearsal, it tore. Othello came farther into the room, hands in his pockets, posture casual. I didn't want to assume anything about him, but it all looked too smooth to be anything but an act. Maybe I was overly cynical now, but it was what it was. It didn't matter much anyway. As long as no one interfered with my work, they could pretend to be anyone or anything they wanted. I pulled a piece of flexible white cardboard out of a small box and turned toward Othello expectantly. When he gave me a blank look, I refrained from rolling my eyes. Where's the one you ripped? Oh, he actually managed to look sheepish. I threw it away. I didn't realize you'd want it back. This wasn't Othello's first play, but it was the biggest part and audience he'd had. He was probably more than a little overwhelmed, and I understood the feeling. I couldn't be too annoyed with him for not knowing even damaged items should be returned to wardrobe. Fixing and repurposing were always options before throwing things away. A great wardrobe department always sought out ways to stay within budget. Sit. I pointed to a low stool. Othello was 6.5 feet tall, with the sort of build that would have made him more likely to be a football player or some other kind of sports star, except he'd gotten into a car accident that had fractured his pelvis when he was only 15. Limited as to which extracurriculars he could participate in that year, a friend of his had convinced him to try drama. I'd made a point to research all the actors on the cast as soon as I'd gotten the list. My boss hadn't asked me to do it, but I'd wanted to familiarize myself with the people with whom I'd be spending a lot of time. Knowing the reputations of each member of the cast helped me know how to handle each one when they were in wardrobe. Who needed the extra attention? Who wouldn't complain until something was really bad? Which people had roaming hands, or were known for their lewd comments? Who'd been on Broadway, on TV, in a movie? All of these things were more important than most people realized. Sit still while I take a measurement, I said. If you turn your head or talk, it can make things more difficult. I remember, he said. Sorry again about not bringing the other one back. Quiet, I reminded him as I put the collar around his neck. His recorded measurements were all in the spiral notebook over on the desk. Josie believed in having both a digital and physical copy of everything. But I didn't want to make a mistake, which meant taking the time to double-check as much as possible. I worked in silence for a moment, my entire focus on the way the collar fit around Othello's muscular neck. I marked the inside of the collar, and then slid it into place in his priest's smock. We'd had to special order one in his size. This thing is tight, Othello complained. Every time I talk, it practically chokes me. I can barely breathe in it. Let me see if there's any way I can adapt it, I said, leaning closer. Give you enough space to breathe. I slid my finger under the collar of the smock, his skin hot against mine. It was easy to ignore, the fact that this good-looking guy was close enough for me to smell whatever cologne he was wearing. It was nice and not too strong, but it didn't do anything for me, for which I was grateful. At least I wouldn't have to deal with crushing on a cast member. I heard you moved here from the West Coast, he said. Were you born out there? Near San Bernardino. I didn't want to be rude and ignore his question. But I didn't want to prolong the conversation either. I finished with my alteration. "How's that?" He rolled his neck, the light glinting off his dark red hair. He took a deep breath, then let it out. "Better, thanks." "It's what I'm here for." I went back to the desk and made a note in the ledger that kept track of all the costumes for the entire cast. Any changes we made needed to be recorded so that if we had to replace something, we didn't waste time having to redo or remember what we'd done in the first place. "Seems awfully quiet back here," he said, his voice closer than I'd thought it to be. Apparently, there was a good reason for that. He was standing right next to me instead of halfway down the hall like I'd expected. "I'm closing up today," I said, taking a step back. "After everyone goes home, I can go too." "Then it's a good thing I came to see you because I'm the last one still here. Well, except for the janitorial staff, but I don't think you meant those guys." "I didn't, but thank you for letting me know." I pulled up the digital wardrobe ledger and entered the same information I'd put on the paper one. He still didn't leave. "Is there something else I can help you with?" I asked without looking up. Why was he still here? Rehearsals were grueling. Shouldn't he be wanting to get home or go out to a bar or whatever it was guys like him did? "Would you like to get something to drink with me?" Shit. Taking in a deep breath, I concentrated on the spreadsheet in my hands. "I appreciate the offer, but I have a few things to finish up here." "I can wait." I looked up to find him grinning at me in a way that made me wonder just how many women that smile had worked on. "Come on, you're new to the city. I grew up in Queens. Let me show you around. We'll have a good time. No pressure." "Thank you," I said, managing to keep my voice polite but firm. "But I don't date people I work with." "Technically, I'm in the cast, and you're in wardrobe, so we don't really work together." He leaned on my desk. "Really?" I raised an eyebrow. "That's what you're going with? You don't work in the same area of the theater, so that means we don't work together?" He shrugged, a strangely graceful movement for such a large man. "If it gets you to go out with me, I'd say it was a good argument." "I'm sorry, Othello, but I really don't think it's a good idea." "For so many reasons." "All right," he said, straightening again. "I won't push, but I had to try." "Have a good evening," I said, hoping he would take it for the hint it was and leave me to my work. "If you ever change your mind, let me know." With a wink, he headed back out, and I breathed a little easier. He was a nice guy, the sort of guy who'd be good to go on a date with because he wouldn't behave like an ass. Not in public, anyway. Maybe he would in private, but at least I wouldn't be completely humiliated. My heart squeezed at the memory. I'd learned my lesson, a harsh one to be sure, but I needed it. Deciding not to date and focus on my career had been something I decided years ago, and it had been confirmed when, in college, my first attempt at having sex had been mediocre at best. I'd had to make the mistake of falling for Joshua, if only so that I could know for certain that it wasn't merely the lack of chemistry with me and Iggy. It was just me. I didn't attract the sort of men who could make a relationship work. I didn't know how to make things work, even with great chemistry, which meant coming to New York was my chance at a fresh start. To make sure I didn't fuck things up again. My career was on the right path, and I was going to keep it that way. Chapter 17. Joshua. Her mouth trailed down my neck, teeth nipping at my skin. I put my hand on her head, digging my fingers into her thick hair. She moved lower and flicked her tongue across my nipple. I moaned, blunt nails scratching her scalp. She lightly bit the sensitive flesh, and I cursed. That mouth of hers. My cock ached as it strained up toward my stomach, wanting, needing. I pushed at her head, and down she went, hair, then lips brushing over my shaft. I shivered as she kissed the tip of my cock, then groaned when she wrapped her lips around the head. Hot and wet, and everything I'd imagined it could be. One hand around the base, stroking what she couldn't fit in her mouth. Up and down, tongue licking and teeth adding that extra pain that made things bright and shiny and explosive. I jerked awake as someone shook me again. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was or what I was doing. Then I saw someone leaning over me, talking, and it all came flooding back. 14 hours. Once I'd heard that Trissa had gone to New York, I'd weighed my options for about 30 seconds before I'd gone back to my place, packed a carry-on bag, and went to the airport. I hadn't expected to get a ticket right away, but I'd known that I couldn't leave the airport until I had a flight booked. I needed to get to New York. Words I never thought I'd think, let alone say. I'd waited for 14 hours on standby, never going farther than the bathroom, eating whatever random snacks I'd shoved into my bag, and refilling my water bottle in the fountain. When they'd finally called my name, I practically run to the counter. Less than 10 minutes later, I was in line for a long, drawn-out flight with 3 connections and a couple layovers. Now, it was Wednesday evening, and I was about to land in New York. I wasn't remotely prepared for this, but there hadn't been another option for me. I tried to move on from Trissa, but the moment I realized she really was gone, I knew I had to go after her. I had to at least try to make things right, to make things work. Even if it meant going home. "We're getting ready to land, sir," the flight attendant said, his tight smile telling me that it wasn't his first time he'd said it. "Thank you." I scrubbed my face with my hands. Sorry I was so hard to wake up. He gave me a more genuine smile and assured me it was okay. I rubbed my eyes and then my forehead. My brain felt like mush. I'd slept most of the way across the country, but that sleep had been broken up by my layovers, and what little I'd had hadn't been good. Well, that last dream hadn't been bad exactly, but a sex dream on a plane could get embarrassing, which is what mine would have been if I hadn't fallen asleep with my jacket on my lap. I just hoped my erection would go away by the time I had to get up. That could be awkward in such close quarters. I leaned back in my seat, but kept my eyes open. I needed to get my head on straight, but I had a feeling if I closed my eyes, I'd fall asleep again. I stayed awake at the airport by doing some research, specifically on Bevian. CB had given me her father's name before I'd left him in the empty apartment. It would have been nice of me to have helped him, but I didn't want to be nice to him. Something told me the breakup hadn't been because of the move. He just rubbed me the wrong way. I couldn't figure out how he'd fucked things up with Bevian so badly that she ended a 3-year relationship and moved to the other side of the continent. I hadn't spent much time with her, but I'd seen how she'd been with Trissa. Plus, there was the fact that her dad was a huge producer in the Big Apple, but she hadn't used that connection to make her career. I had a feeling that if I actually got to know her, I'd like her. In fact, considering who both her parents were, Bevian didn't actually have much in the way of an online presence. She had the basic social media accounts, but wasn't one of those people who felt like she had to post about every little thing that was going on in her life. While her family occasionally made the papers, nothing was trashy or lurid. Bevian hadn't partied or been arrested. She hadn't been friends with or dated people who were like that either. I was pretty sure I'd been stalking my girl's best friend. Okay, not my girl, because I'd fucked that up before it had even been able to start. But I wanted her to be my girl, my woman, my everything. How much did it suck that I hadn't known what I wanted until it had been too late? I blew out a long, frustrated breath. No, that wasn't fair. She'd caught my attention from the first moment I'd seen her, on her ass, glaring up at me, and cursing because I'd foiled her attempt to catch a purse thief. If I hadn't been such a coward, I wouldn't have hidden behind, pretending that she needed my help, and just told her that I needed her help. I needed to protect her. And I had, that night. Then I'd been the one to hurt her. A jolt of turbulence made my seatmate grab the armrests. A scared little squeak the only sound she made. Normally, I would have kept to myself. She was an adult, and the plane wasn't in trouble, but I didn't want to be that guy anymore. The guy who only thought about himself and blamed his problems on everyone else. "It's going to be okay." I said as I reached over to pat her arm. She reminded me of my Nana. She'd passed away the winter after I turned 12. I've always been a nervous flyer, she admitted. 16 trips all over the world, and when it comes time to land or take off, or if there's some turbulence, I go to pieces. Does distraction help? I asked. You can tell me about some of those trips. Thank you, dear, she said. That would be wonderful. What was your favorite trip? I asked. The one you liked the best. She thought for a minute. Versailles. I went there with my lover, Franco. He was much younger than me. She gave me a once-over, a gleam in her eyes. Definitely not like my Nana. The first 3 days we didn't leave our hotel room. My seatmate continued. He was insatiable, that one. The things we did. Let's just say there are some things that are only legal in Versailles. I now regretted my decision to be a better person. By the time we landed, and I got away from Velma, yes, that was her actual name, I was determined to never talk to any strangers ever again. The things she told me about her sex life were now permanently seared into my mind, and not in a good way. She had accomplished one thing, though. I hadn't thought about Trissa once during the entire conversation. Now, however, I was focused on my goal again. Since the chances of Trissa answering her phone to tell me where she lived were slim to none, I had to figure out another way of finding her. I'd given it a lot of thought during my time waiting at the airport, and one thing I kept coming back to was that I only knew one person in the city who had a specific connection to Trissa, Bevian Kelly. Because I had no way of knowing where Bevian was either, I had to play the 6 degrees of separation game and find people who knew Bevian. That was actually easier, since I now knew that her parents were Dennis Kelly and Francie Bevian Kelly. Francie served on the boards of several charitable organizations, which meant it'd be a bit more difficult to see her without an appointment, as I didn't have the schedule of which charities she visited which day. Besides, with her daughter recently returned from California, Francie might have changed her schedule entirely. That left Dennis. A producer like him would be difficult to get a sit-down with, but at least I had a better chance of catching him since he had a specific office. I would call first thing in the morning to see about getting an appointment, though I wasn't holding out much hope for that. I'd known enough people in the entertainment industry to know that being connected to the right people made all the difference when it came to getting a face-to-face. I also knew that there was no way a father would give me information about his daughter if I just called. As much as I wanted to go straight from the airport to find Trissa, I knew that wouldn't work. New York wasn't like a small town where I could ask around a couple places and someone would point me in the right direction. Even if I could find someone to tell me where the Kelly family lived, showing up at their house uninvited would be a sure way to get either arrested for trespassing or sent away, losing my shot at getting information. That meant getting Dennis at his office tomorrow morning would be my best shot. With nothing else to do tonight, I took a taxi to the best-priced hotel I could find that had an open room. Fortunately, this wasn't a holiday, and nothing huge was going on in the middle of the week. Otherwise, I would have been stuck. A little voice in the back of my mind reminded me that I'd never really be stuck without a place to stay when I was in New York City. My parents, after all, still lived in the same 2-bedroom house in the Bronx where I'd grown up. My 2 brothers and I had been crammed into a single bedroom for all of my childhood, but at the same time, it hadn't been that bad. I'd idolized my big brothers and often stayed up well past my bedtime so I could talk to them after they came to bed hours later. Things had changed when we'd gotten older, and by the time I was a teenager, the hero worship I'd once had no longer existed. I still admired David for all of his hard work and the life he'd built for himself with his wife and 2 kids. Nathaniel? Well, he was another matter entirely. A matter I didn't want to think about. I had enough shit in my head to deal with. If Trissa wanted to stay in New York, however, I might not have a choice about dealing with it. I couldn't very well move back here and avoid my family. And if I were to be completely honest, I needed to deal with it whether I stayed here or not. I couldn't claim that I wanted to be a better man while still holding grudges. First, I'd find Trissa. Then I'd decide how I wanted to handle things with Nathaniel. Plan firmly set in mind, I paid and thanked the cabbie before going into the hotel. Welcome home. I wanted to get up and pace, but the receptionist was already annoyed with me, and I had a feeling that would push her over the edge. I hadn't done anything that could merit having security toss me out, but I didn't want to test her patience. Instead, I tapped my fingers on my knees, more restless than I could ever remember being. I glanced at my watch. Sure, another hour had passed since I'd last looked, but only 20 minutes had gone by. I'd been outside of Dennis Kelly's office since 9 o'clock, and now it wasn't far from noon. But since I didn't have an appointment, I couldn't expect to have someone else's appointment bumped simply because I wanted to talk to him. Besides, being a pushy asshole wouldn't make him more likely to give me the information I wanted. The door to his office opened, and a tall, thin woman came out. She greeted the receptionist by name and didn't even glance in my direction. I wondered who she was and what she needed to talk to Dennis about. "I'm going to take an early lunch, Sydney." I turned my attention back to the office and saw Dennis standing in the doorway. Before the receptionist could respond, I was on my feet and walking toward him. "Mr. Kelly." "Sit down," the receptionist snapped at me. I ignored her. "Mr. Kelly, my name is Joshua Lexington, and I just need a few minutes of your time, sir." "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Lexington?" The receptionist was on her feet. "He does not." Kelly looked more amused than annoyed. "As you can see, Sydney here is quite protective of my time." "I know, sir, but I wouldn't have come if it wasn't important." I glanced at Sydney, who was glaring at me, lips pursed. "I'm Nathaniel Lexington's little brother." I hated myself even as I blurted out the words, but I was desperate. "The CEO of Manhattan Records? That Nathaniel Lexington?" His dark gray eyes gleamed in a way that reminded me of his daughter. "Yes, sir," I said. He studied me for a moment before turning back toward the door he'd just exited. "I have a few minutes. Come on in." I followed him into his office, surprised at how simple it was. Dennis Kelly was definitely not one of those men who felt like they had to make their office intimidating. "Sit." He gestured to the chairs on one side of the desk. He took a seat on the other side. "I must say, you filled in a lot of blanks for me just now." I was confused. "I did?" "My daughter might not tell me every single thing that goes on in her life, but she does share a great deal with me. Damn it. If Bevian told her father how badly I'd treated Trissa, I'd never get any information out of him. I didn't rush to defend myself, though. My actions were indefensible. She told me your name and described you accurately, even mentioned something about you being a musician." He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands in front of him. "Now that I know who your brother is, I remember your name from several years ago. All sorts of rumors, but nothing ever confirmed. And then you disappeared." "I went to L.A., I said, forcing my jaw to relax. I wasn't going to have my personal business dragged through the mud while the paparazzi took pictures. "But you're back in New York now," he said. "Why?" "Because I screwed up and lost someone amazing," I answered honestly. "I want to apologize to her, face to face. She deserves at least that." "But that's not the whole reason, is it?" He raised an eyebrow and waved a hand. "Continue." "I want her to give me a second chance," I said after taking a long breath. "But I can't ask her for that if I can't find her. You were the only person I could think of who'd know where Trissa is." "I do know where she and my daughter are," he said, leaning back in his chair and giving me a hard look. "Give me a good reason why I should share that information, instead of forcefully telling you to go back to L.A. "Because I'm falling in love with her," I said simply, surprising even myself with the honesty of the words. I could come up with a dozen flowery sentiments about how bad things have been since I lost her, or how I'd actually gotten music back in my life because of her. But it all comes down to one thing: love. He studied me for nearly a full minute before giving me a single nod. "All right, I'll tell you what you need to know." Chapter 18. Trissa. Josie had been impressed by how I'd handled the whole collar thing with Othello. Apparently, he'd been complaining to the director almost every day about how much it was choking him, and no one had been able to figure out how to fix it. Or more accurately, no one had bothered coming to the wardrobe department about it. Despite the fact that I'd turned him down the night before, Othello had made a point of coming to see me during his lunch break to tell me how much easier it had been for him to perform with a new collar. He was a sweet guy, and if I'd been at a different place in my life, I might have actually wanted to take him up on his offer. But I wasn't in that place. I wanted to focus on my career. Only my career. It had nothing to do with the memories I hadn't been able to get rid of, or the dreams that kept coming every time I closed my eyes. Joshua had been an example of why this was the right thing to do, a reminder of what would happen if I lost my focus. It wasn't entirely fair, I knew. After all, the movie production closing hadn't been Joshua's fault. I hadn't lost my job because I'd been trying to have a romantic life. If I was being truly honest with myself, technically, it was because of Joshua I'd gotten this job. If he hadn't been such an ass, I might not have made the move. I sighed. So much for me not thinking about Joshua. I hadn't even known him for a month. Why couldn't I stop thinking about him? Maybe Bevian and I could go out tonight. She could show me around the city. We could have some drinks. Not enough to get drunk since we both had to work tomorrow, but enough to get my mind off things. I owed her a drink anyway. The fact that she'd asked me to move with her had meant a lot to me. Even better, she'd arranged for us to have a place together. Her mom, Francie, had known of a couple with a condo they'd wanted to rent out while they traveled through Europe for a year. Since they owned the property outright, they were only asking that we pay utilities and not make any permanent changes. If I'd waited to come here on my own, I would have ended up in a tiny apartment, barely big enough for a bed, paying through the nose as I worked a full-time job and tried to find work in my field. Basically, a more expensive version of what I'd been doing in Los Angeles. More expensive, and I would have been doing it alone. I talked to my mom and youngest brother a couple of times since I arrived in New York, worried that even though they'd said they understood why I needed to move, now that it had actually happened, they'd be upset. They weren't, though. All they wanted to know was how I was doing, what work was like, how I liked New York. Their support had taken off a lot of the tension from the move, made it possible for me to focus on settling in and doing my best at work. "Hey, Bevy," I called as I opened the door to our place. "What do you think about going out to get something to drink?" The end of my question faded away as I saw that Bevian wasn't alone on our couch. "Joshua?" His name came out in a whisper. He stood up, expression tight, cheeks red. He rubbed his hands on his pants. "Hey, Trissa." "Well, I'm going to take that as my cue," Bevian said, standing as well. "I'm having dinner with my parents tonight, and I'll probably have a few glasses of wine, so I'll crash in my old bedroom." I glared at her, filled with panic and hope. "You don't need to leave." "I think I do." She grinned so big my desire to commit my first murder increased. "This isn't a talk I should be around for. You should be around for the talk you and I are going to have." I scowled at her, begging her with my eyes to stay. Every cell in my body was twisting with every emotion I'd ever known, and I didn't trust myself to be alone with him. "We need to talk about letting random people into the house." She put her hand on my arm, her expression sobering. "Listen to him, Trissa. You know I'm pissed at pretty much every one of the male species right now. But this guy?" She glanced over her shoulder to where Joshua was still standing, trying to look like he couldn't hear every word of our conversation. "He knows he screwed up. I think he could be one of the few good ones." With that pronouncement, she left me glaring after her. So much for having her support. I turned toward Joshua, ready to tell him to get out. But before I said a word, I thought better of it. Maybe the reason I couldn't stop thinking about him was because I hadn't gotten any closure. If I let him say his piece and then told him to leave, then maybe I'd be able to move on. Well, not move on in the dating sense, but at least get him out of my head. "I listened to your voicemail." He flushed. looking down with unmistakable embarrassment. Both of them? Just the first one. I put my purse on the table next to the couch, but didn't sit down. I wanted us on equal footing. It was enough. Just in case you don't want to listen to anything else I came to say, I have to say this, especially since you didn't hear me say it in that second voicemail. He sounded different, tired, and something else I couldn't quite put a finger on. I'm sorry. I waited for the excuses to follow, the accusations, but they didn't come. And nothing. He looked at me now. I was an ass. I was in a bad mood, and I took it out on you. There's no excuse for it. I sighed. I almost wished he'd gone off like he had on the phone. Maybe then I would have felt justified in throwing him out, gotten the closure I needed. But he'd come all this way for an apology, not to tell me why it was my fault. Sit down, I said. We'll talk. Chapter 19. Joshua. I told myself not to get my hopes up, that she was only going to listen. It probably wouldn't make any difference, but I had to try. I got drunk after you left, I said when she seated next to me on the couch. It was on the other end, but at least she'd yielded enough to sit, and I'd take that as a win. That's when I called you and left that awful, rambling message. I don't remember most of what I said, but I know it couldn't have been nice. I was offloading everything I was feeling on you. A muscle in her jaw twitched, and she still wouldn't look me in the eye. I had to tell her more. Just explaining my behavior within that short time period wasn't going to do it. If I wanted her to trust me, to be willing to give me a second shot, I needed to take a risk, more than one. I was terrified. I'd never felt more raw, more honest. Her gaze snapped up, locking with mine. Terrified? I was falling so hard and so fast for you that my head spun, I admitted. That's how I found out where you live, by the way. I went to see Bevian's father, and I told him what I should have told you first. I'm falling in love with you. I waited to let that sink in. She looked like she'd just been shocked, her eyes wide, cheeks pink. I'm not asking you to say it back, I said, but I'm not going to run from it either, and I'm not going to push you away. Not anymore. That's what you wanted to tell me? She found her voice. That you were falling in love with me, and you were just pushing me away? Why? Because you're too immature to have a real relationship? I shook my head. No. Well, not exactly. I'm not trying to excuse my actions, just explain them. I've never wanted to explain anything like this before. I feel so honored. Her sarcasm made me smile even though I was sure it meant she wasn't going to let me say it all. If she was going to stop me, there was one thing I needed her to know. I've spent the last 10 years blaming everyone else for everything, I said, shoving both hands through my hair. That's what I was doing. I was terrified by what I felt for you and pissed off about not getting that job. And I did what I always do. I put it all on someone else, so I didn't have to accept that I wasn't owed anything. That even though I'd had some shit happen to me, I needed to start taking responsibility for things. She frowned, but something in her eyes told me that she was truly listening rather than just placating me. I started Juilliard when I was in high school and stayed for college. While I was there, I met a woman named Kala Evenstar. We dated. She put up a hand. You're telling me about a woman who broke your heart to make me feel sorry for you? I shook my head. No, I don't want that, and it wasn't that simple. It never is, she muttered. She leaned back and gestured for me to continue. I graduated and joined up with a band as a keyboardist and songwriter. Kala dropped out and began auditioning for singing positions. I supported her, but the band I was in didn't fit with what she was looking for, and she wasn't happy that we were doing so well when she couldn't get anyone to hire her. I clasped my hands together as I approached the part of my story I really didn't like thinking about, let alone talking about. My brother is Nathaniel Lexington, CEO of Manhattan Records. Trissa blinked. Okay, I was not expecting that bit of backstory. I shrugged. No one ever does. Honestly, I think if anyone thought of there being a connection, they'd discount it as soon as I didn't mention it. Most people with connections use them. I only did one time, and I still regret it. You went to your brother with your band and your girlfriend? Sort of. I took a deep breath before continuing my story. The band was good, really good. I didn't think of it as asking for a favor because I figured we'd give the label as much as we got. Nathaniel listened to us and then offered us a contract. We were in the negotiation stage when I found out that my brother had also offered Kala a deal, if she slept with him. He was happy to tell me she hadn't even needed time to think about it. Shit. Yeah. I waited for the usual pain that came with thinking about that betrayal, except it was different than before. I found that I didn't care about Kala's side of things. It was only Nathaniel I still had issues with. Progress. Things got worse. Seriously? She stared at me. I shrugged. In pretty much one breath, he told me that he'd fucked my girlfriend in exchange for giving her a demo, and then told my band that our contract would be null and void if I stayed on. The only way they got signed was if they fired me. It took them less than 5 minutes to fire me, and 3 of that was spent haggling over how much of the music I'd written was actually mine, and how much belonged to them. Motherfucker. I had to admit, hearing someone angry for me was more gratifying than I'd imagine it would be. My parents and David had always said they believed me about what Nathaniel had done, but they'd been the only ones. Nathaniel then essentially blackballed me. I spent nearly 2 years trying to find work here before I moved to LA and took a job at Chase Advertising. I felt my cheeks heat as I gave her a wry look, writing jingles for fluffy-bottom toilet paper. Trissa was silent for several seconds, and I waited to see what she'd finally say. Wow, when you said you'd had some shit happen, this is not what I'd imagined. Like I said, I don't want pity, and I'm not excusing how I behaved. You weren't responsible for anything that happened to me, and I had no right to direct my bad mood at you. You're right, she said, her expression softening as she looked at me. Except I could have handled things better. I understand what it's like to get shitty news about a career that you've always wanted. I could have cut you some slack. I reached over to put my hand on hers before I even considered whether or not it'd be a good idea. Neither one of us is perfect, but this is my mea culpa. Let me have it. She laughed, which was exactly what I'd been going for. Damn, I wanted her. But more than wanting her in bed, I wanted her not to hate me. You said you loved me? She said, putting her free hand over mine. We barely know each other. How could you know that? I smiled at her. Because I came back to a city where I experienced my worst memory in hopes that you might be willing to give me a do-over for a date. She leaned forward and brushed her lips against mine, the surprised movement freezing me in place. This, between us, I thought I could walk away from it, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. I can't say I love you too because I don't know, yet. My heart lurched. I don't want you to do or say anything you don't want or feel. I just want a second chance, even though I know I don't deserve one. She paused for a moment, then asked, I can't move back to LA. It'd be a step backward, and I've worked so hard that I'll stay here, I cut in. I'd known this would probably be the way things would have to go, but this was the first time I'd said it out loud. I'll look for a job, any job. The very tip of her nose turned pink as tears glistened in her eyes. You'd do that? I would, I said honestly. And it's not some whim. I truly thought about it, and I won't regret it, no matter where I end up working. I just need to be near you. You, Trissa, are my music. We stared at each other for so long, so intimately. Just being next to her gave me a peace I didn't completely understand. She smiled and swiped at a tear that had fallen. I might have a lead for you. The late-night show where Bevian's working just lost their music director. I think they'd be psyched to have a Juilliard graduate apply for the job, if you want it. I tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I want all of it. And just like that, I was a New Yorker once again, with a great line on a job in my field and Trissa. Chapter 20. Trissa. If someone had asked me this morning what could possibly make today any better, I would have said that I couldn't think of anything, because Joshua showing up wasn't anything I could have predicted. I'd never imagined that he could have felt as strongly about me as I did about him. I thought my own feelings had been just that, mine and mine alone. It was too fast, and we had too much to work through. That's what everyone would say if we asked them. That's what Bevian would tell me, no matter how much she'd been rooting me on earlier. I didn't even want to think about what my family would think. If I was being honest, though, for once in my life, I refused to care about what anyone else said. I'd been helping take care of my family since my father had walked out on us when I was 13. My mom was a good parent, and she hadn't put that sort of responsibility on me, but I'd taken it on myself, even after I'd moved to LA. Taking care of them had been high on my priority list, but when I told them I was moving to New York, she told me to do what made me happy. So maybe Mom would understand, but that was something for another day. Right now, I only wanted to focus on the man who'd spent the time while I was in the shower cleaning up after our quick dinner. He'd promised me a real first date, with no expectations, a complete do-over. I told him that I'd take the date, but that I didn't want to wait until then to spend time together. He looked relieved when he'd agreed. We'd been apart for nearly a week, and we'd both felt off-kilter because of it. I heard him moving around in the kitchen, and headed that way instead of going into my bedroom. Bevian wouldn't be home tonight, which meant I didn't need to drag Joshua to my room for what I wanted. He turned as I came into the kitchen, his jaw dropping. His eyes darkened as they slid over me, my skin glistening from still clinging moisture, a towel the only thing covering me. I kept walking, stopping only when I was close enough to tug on the bottom of his shirt. He pulled it off, tossing it aside before picking me up and setting me on the counter. I've never missed anyone the way I've missed you these last few days. He slid his hand along my jaw and back into my wet hair. His fingers massaged my scalp and my eyelids half closed, a moan escaping as I leaned into his hand. You make the sexiest noises, he said a moment before his mouth covered mine. The kiss was soft and slow, without any of the urgency I'd expected. He was taking his time, exploring even as I ran my fingers over his chest, nails scraping over his flat nipples, then lightly raking down until I reached the waistband of his pants. I spread my legs, hooking them around his hips and pulling him closer. He groaned, rocking against me, and the restraint he'd been showing cracked. His hand tightened in my hair, and he bit down on my bottom lip, tugging on it even as I opened his pants and reached down to wrap my hand around his cock. Fuck, he growled as he raised his head. He used my hair to tilt my head back, and with the other hand, pulled his wallet out of his back pocket. A few moments later, he held up a familiar foil packet. Lucky I remembered one. I'm guessing neither of you wanted to bring any protection from LA. A smile played on his lips. I don't like to throw anything away. I've got that box in the table next to my bed. Good, he said. We'll make sure they don't go to waste. Heat coiled in my stomach at that promise, and I grabbed the packet. I used my teeth to tear it open, keeping one hand moving over the hardening flesh I was gripping. The memory of how he'd felt inside me made my pussy throb in anticipation. I could only imagine how he would feel, skin to skin. It took me a couple minutes to get the condom on right, but Joshua didn't say anything as he watched. I could sense the tension coming off him, and a stab of pride went through me. I made him this way. This gorgeous, talented man wanted me. His jeans fell to his knees, but he didn't bother removing them. He was too focused on sliding a hand up my leg, burning the skin with his palm. His thumb brushed the dark curls between my thighs, then moved up to one bare breast. He cupped the flesh under my towel, teased my nipple until it was hard, and then left it to chafe against the soft cotton while his hand moved to the small of my back. He pressed his lips to my ear. Do you need my fingers to get you ready? I turned my head before answering, wanting to see the expression on his face. I already used mine, thinking about you, making myself come. His mouth crashed against mine, bruising my lips against my teeth. He pulled me toward him even as he surged forward, burying himself in one mind-numbing thrust. When I gasped, he pushed his tongue into my mouth. He held me in place, tongue plundering even as he drove into me over and over. The base of his cock pressed against my clit with each thrust, the already sensitive nerves firing overtime. I clung to his shoulders, scratching as I shook against him. We'd started slow, but I doubted anything between us would ever truly be slow. It felt like we'd been waiting so long for each other, we didn't want to miss another moment. This wasn't a distraction from my life. It was my life. Would be my life. Yes, my career was important, but it wouldn't be enough. I knew that now. Maybe if I'd never met him, I wouldn't have learned what it could be like. But now that I did, I'd never be satisfied with anything less. I need you to come, Trissa. His forehead rested against mine, his lips hovering over my mouth. I don't think I can last much longer. I want you too much. Please, baby, come. I could feel his muscles trembling under my hands, feel his tenuous control slipping. He was trying to make it good for me. But all I needed for it to be good was for it to be with him. His hands slipped between us, thumb finding my clit swollen and throbbing. 2 rough circles over it, and I went over the edge, burying my face against his chest. His hips jerked, and the hand on my back tensed, fingers digging into flesh as he held me tight. He was impossibly big, and my brain couldn't process all of the signals being sent from every inch of my body. And the world was small and large at the same time. I could feel every place we touched and connected. I'd never been so fully aware of another person. It wasn't until I started to come down that I realized he was chanting something. A single word, barely loud enough to be a whisper. It was my name. I held him to me, my turn to offer him solace as he processed and came back to himself. I ran my fingers through his hair and wrapped my legs more tightly around his waist. We'd need to move soon, if only because my towel had fallen at some point and I was getting cold. But for the moment, I was content here. I waited until we'd made it to my bedroom, and we were both beneath the covers, limbs entwined, muscles sore, and our appetite for each other barely sated, before I told him what I'd known for a while. I'm falling in love with you too. I tipped my head back so I could watch his face light up. And I don't care if anyone else thinks things are going too fast. I know my own mind, and I know what I want. He caught my chin and gave me a sweet kiss, chaste by comparison to the other kisses we'd shared that night, but no less meaningful. It didn't matter where or how we had sex. It was making love. When's your next day off? He asked, tone thoughtful. Sunday. Why? Now that I'm going to be living here, I think it's time for me to reach out to my family. All of them. All of them, including the brother who'd betrayed him. I tightened my arms around him and rested my head on his chest. If you want me there, I want to go with you. And if his asshole brother so much as looked at Joshua cross-eyed, I'd make him sorry he was ever born. This is His Inspiration, written by M.S. Parker. Narrated by Peter Beck. Copyright 2019, Belmonte Publishing, LLC. Production copyright 2019 by Belmonte Publishing, LLC.